of the Kenneth Smith Millennia and Microcosm seminar. We are working our way through a book that to be published, maybe in a few years here, called Millennia and Microcosm. And Kenneth Smith wrote it as a series of columns back in the 1998 to 2000 timeframe. The overall column was called End Times, and the magazine was the Comics Journal of all places. and he was writing about the end of the millennium and using that as an opportunity to go back and look at the previous millennia and kind of what has been the course of human affairs over the past 2,000 years at a large scale. And his reason for doing that wasn't mere curiosity, but he's investigating the hypothesis that this is an existential philosophical hypothesis that there's a zeitgeist to each age, and the zeitgeist frames the way that the inhabitants of that epoch interpret the world. So that even people who are in opposition to each other, who think of themselves as mortal enemies and as far apart as they could possibly get, will turn out to have an enormous amount in common with each other. That people from another epoch could look at and go, "Wow, you guys are almost indistinguishable from each other. I don't even see why you're fighting." It's this idea of we don't know who discovered water, but we're pretty certain it wasn't a fish, right? When you and everybody you know are all inhabiting the same interpretive framework, how can you possibly notice that it's at work in you? It's always there. As Hegel says, what is familiar to us is for that very reason not seen for what it truly is. And so that's the premise of this book. He's looking at the ancient epoch in chapter 4. He's looking at the medieval epoch in chapters 5 through 13. And then starting in chapter 14, he's going to look at the modern epoch. And you say, well, why is he going to look at the modern epoch? That's the one we know the best. But of course, we only half know it the best. We're the most familiar with it. But the things that we take for granted are the things that we understand the least because we don't think about them as having choices that we could make. So the purpose of this is to kind of learn how to see the world through the ancient lenses, and we spent 2 years working on that. And then to learn how to see the world through medieval lenses, which we're in the middle of now. Well, we're two-thirds of a year into of what's going to be a 2-year arc on this. And then when we finish, we'll come back to the modern epoch and we'll look at it not from the modern worldviews perspective, but we'll look at it from the ancient and medieval perspectives. And we'll contrast them with each other and contrast them with our assumptions that we have as moderns and use that to triangulate. And the goal is to get us out of the labyrinth that we're trapped in, to get us to where the modern perspective is one that we can put on and we can take off. We can use it voluntarily. We can use it when it makes the most sense, when it illuminates things that are useful, but whenever it becomes a problem, we can take it off and put on one of the other perspectives. And of course, the premise of this book is that there's more than 3. These are just 3 that are well documented from the course of European history. And having gone through this exercise, one can then turn to the rest of the world and say, let's look at, medieval Chinese, ancient Chinese, modern Chinese perspectives. What about God? India is just a factory of perspectives. So many perspectives coming out of India, Japan, Africa. There's so many places we could be looking for different angles on reality. And the idea is that we need these because every mortal perspective is finite, but reality is not finite. Reality is vast and complex, far beyond what we can keep track of. And so we don't want to let ourselves be prisoners of the limitations of these simple mortal perspectives. We want to get a whole toolbox full of different perspectives and be able to shift between them. So that's the premise of the book, and that's where we are in the book. We're at the end of this year, we will be at the halfway point.
Could I ask a very simple question? It seems to me where he wrote it seems to have meaning. I can't help but think of
Yes,
the comic general,
yes,
because on the one hand, it could just be about irony, like, huh, it's like that, which means it's sort of like bogged down. On the other hand, comedy, it could be that at the end of history or at the end of this and the end of the fourth turning, it will turn well, despite how bad it is. So those are 2 very different meanings of comedy. One is
yes.
like irony, you kind of laugh at, huh, this is really strange. Why are we in this place? And then the other one is that Yeah, we're in a tough place, but once we cross the road, across the horizon, it will turn comedy in a good sense. So it's a very because the word the philosophy is written, you got to ask that question. I mean, if it's written in the Bible, it has a different meaning. Okay, that's just a short question.
It's a
Could you
good
say something
question.
about that?
Yeah, he talked about this in the column, and some of it makes it into chapters 1 and 2. But the general idea is that at the turn of the millennium, people were panicking about Y2K and what happens if all the software crashes and our plane's going to fall out of the sky and are we all going to die? And uh, and he said, well, you're right to be asking big questions. That's what philosophy is for, is to ask big questions. Where are we going? Are we in trouble? What should we be doing next? He says, this isn't the first time people have had giant panics and started for a moment looking up from their immediate life to the larger picture and asking questions. He says, but since everyone's taking a moment to look up, maybe we should take this moment to really consider the big picture. He's running off of a quote from the German 19th century philosopher Goethe, who says, whoever cannot recount the past 2 millennia of history to himself is drifting through life aimless. And so in this book, he's recounting about 2,500 years, 2,700 years of philosophical history and perspectives. So this was kind of what led him to take this opportunity. These are what are called, philosophy grapples with what are sometimes called millennial questions, because they're the questions that people often don't change their fundamental answers to for 1,000 years. They sort of stick within a mode of thought until it doesn't work anymore. So so he's using millennia to take us back across the millennia and look at multiple frames of reference. And he's not trying to predict the outcome. For those who are new to these calls, Kenneth Smith is an existentialist philosopher, not an escapist philosopher. He's not trying to make himself a guru. He's not trying to teach us a system that we'll all memorize and recite like little robots or zombies. He's a philosophy teacher. And so he's trying to point us at the great conversation that's been going on for thousands of years. His writing style, I know. Yeah, Stephen puts in the chat. Panic 1000 AD, it was Jesus. 2000 AD, it was a computer program. So yeah, that will be a recurring theme about the lowering of our scope and expectations in the modern epoch. But yes, so his approach is he's going to be pointing us to a lot of other authors. He wants us to go engage with this long conversation that's been happening and to think about these things people are asking. So in chapter 7, which we're just finishing up today, here's a list. I just put it in the chat of different philosophers and writers and artists who he alludes to, usually by name, sometimes by quotes, sometimes both. And it is in his style that the way you read Kenneth Smith is over time you start to learn that he's using certain keywords, and those keywords are references to whole philosophers and philosophies. And when you see those words, don't read them the way you would read them in a book of fiction or a newspaper. Stop and consider, oh, I see what he's doing here. And we're going to do that today. This is something you learn over time. I've been reading Kenneth for 25, 27 years, something like that. No, oh God, 32 years, something like that. So I've built up a repertoire of these keywords, but you can start anywhere. And one of the ways to look is when you find sentences in Kenneth that hit you wrong, and you read them, you go, well, it sounds like he's just insulting somebody. Like if he calls someone an idiot, you say, oh, he's calling him a dummy. But idiot is a keyword for Kenneth. He always says idiot comes from the Greek idiota, meaning one's own. Says the problem for human beings is that we are stuck in our own perspective. We never look through somebody else's eyes. We always look through our eyes. And the same is true for the way we see the world. And so the Greek existentialist tradition says one of the fundamental problems for Homo sapiens is that we're idiots. You can imagine that the gods might be able to see from multiple angles at the same time, but mortals can't do that. And so it causes us no end of problems. And this is how he uses the word idiot. And as an idiot, as with being an alcoholic, you can have one of two approaches. You can either be in denial and just let yourself be ruled by this flaw in your character, or you can accept that it's true and then start reorganizing your life to say, now, how am I going to compensate for this defect? So in the case of alcoholism, I don't ever drink ever for any reason because my family for generations on both sides all spent many years and sometimes their entire lives in the bottle. So, easy for me to figure out. In the case of being an idiot, another thing that I'm born into, well, I have to engage in activities that will help me to question my assumptions and question my perspectives. And that's the framework of this book. That's what it's doing. So something to know when you're reading Kenneth. It's not meant to be read rapidly. It's meant to be chewed on. And frequently it's meant, you read a little bit and then you pause and you go, oh, why is he quoting Mark Twain here? And then you go pull up Mark Twain and look at Mark Twain and see what Mark Twain had to say that was the equivalent. You go, oh, I see the larger picture. And then you come back and continue. So it's something to take your time with, savor, as we've been doing for the last 2.5 years with this book. All right, let's dive into things then. So I think we're going to finish chapter 7 today because we've only got one paragraph left, 12, and it's a summary paragraph. It's interesting, but it's a summary. So then I think we will move on to chapter 8, paragraph 1. I'm going to drop into the chat David's. This is a new thing I've started doing in the last month. David's summaries that he writes on the meetup page are quite good. So just to frame the discussion, oh, hi, Fred, welcome to the call. And actually, since you just joined, let me throw the links in the chat again so that you can find the text that we're working on. There we go. End of chapter 7, and then later in the call, start of chapter 8. So David says, join us for a penetrating discussion of Kenneth Smith's exploration of sin as more than moral failure, as a profound spiritual misalignment, drawing on its etymology as a splitting off, quote unquote, and the Greek tragic concept of hamartia, which means missing the mark. Smith shows how sin begins in the seductions of ego, a blindness to what is central and essential. He contrasts the unifying force of spirit with ego's cutting edge. And I'm just going to take a step out for a second. This alludes to a theme that Stephen has been bringing up since the beginning of these seminars, which is in any given people, what is the balance between the centripetal forces that pull them together as a people, what the Greeks called philia, versus the centrifugal forces that cause a people to fight each other and fly apart, to fragment and to no longer be capable of acting as a coherent organism. And that's what the Greeks call nekos. So when David says he contrasts the unifying force of spirit with ego's cutting edge, he's talking about ego as a centrifugal force, a contributor to nekos, and spirit in the way that the medievals conceive of it, not the way moderns do, but the medieval revolution that pushed back against the ancient world was positing spirit as a force that could be centripetal, that could pull us together into a philia, a brotherhood of man. So this is what he's alluding to here. He continues, which severs us from the very source of our higher intelligence. Through Aristotle's insight that intellect sharpens with use, and Kierkegaard's paradox that self-denial leads to greater abundance, we will consider how the spiritual life integrates rather than rejects the aesthetic. This session will invite us to think deeply about what it means to choose the better part, and that's a quote from the Bible, from the New Testament, and live from the infinite rather than the finite. So he's doing a good job. David's doing a good job here of summarizing what we've been through in chapter 7 so far into a nice compact flow. So with that, why don't we get started with paragraph 12? The opening couple of sentences begin Kenneth's summary of chapter 7, and it has several important references hiding in here. Kenneth begins, in Greek tragedy, there's a point called the peripeteia, or reversal, at which all the previously free actions become all too patently self-enslaving. Intelligence beclouds itself, and judgment commits itself to the ruin of its own life. Civilizations, too, experience such ironic reversals. Now, he's talking, this is paragraph 12. Earlier in this chapter, we've talked about Oedipus, Tyrannus, by Sophocles as a classic example of Greek tragedy. And Greek tragedy, although moderns think of it as a literary form, the ancient Greeks thought of Greek tragedy as a philosophical form. They thought of tragedy as a divine rite dedicated to Dionysus. And although moderns think Dionysus might be the same as Bacchus, and maybe he's that god of getting drunk, to the Greeks, Dionysus was the companion of Apollo. And Apollo was the god of the conscious mind. of enlightenment, of things that we can logically work. Oh, we'll come to Kierkegaard, Stephen. We will. Apollo was the god of the conscious mind and logic, rationality, and so on. What the Greeks called noesis. But Dionysus was the god of the unconscious mind, all the things within us that are part of our character or nature that is not clear to us. And the Greeks believe that is a vast realm, right? Heraclitus said, hi, Andrew, welcome to the call. And let me drop into the chat the links to the text. Here you go. And we are at the end, the last paragraph of chapter 7, and we're just starting into sentences 1 and 2 here. So now we're talking about tragedy. And so the Greeks believed that tragedy was a divine right, and R-I-T-E, not R-I-G-H-T. And even the oracle at Delphi, where the prophecies were given by the Pythonists, we talk about that all the time in colloquial speech in the modern era as though it's the temple of Apollo. But that's a misnomer. It's in fact a profound misunderstanding of exactly the kind a modern would make, because the way we know in part that it's the temple of Apollo is not the front, but one side of the building depicts Apollo. But the other side, the opposite side of the building, depicts Dionysus. The Greeks believed that the oracle was speaking for Apollo and Dionysus together to reveal the relationship between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind, because they believed the unconscious mind was every bit as important as the conscious mind. And so the art of tragedy, or even comedy, both of them were designed to act out in front of us all visibly what's normally hidden inside the human character. I think I was just starting to say the Heraclitus quote is that you couldn't determine the limits of your own psyche, even if you spent your entire life searching all of its roads and byways, such as its profundity. In other words, it's essentially an infinite topic, just like the world around us is an infinite topic. And so Heraclitus and Aristotle and others are positing a world in which Homo sapiens is an amphibian that inhabits two infinities: the infinity of nature around us, which is lawful and organized according to physis, which is the character of the cosmos, but also the infinity inside each one of us, our own ethos, our character, which is the lawful nature that determines what we're going to do from moment to moment. What do we notice? What do we care about? What do we act on or don't act on? All of that, they believe, came from our inner nature. And it was the purpose of theater, by the way, theater thea, the gods, theater, to reveal this invisible thing where we could all look at it and feel something about it and learn something about it, and then maybe not be prisoners of our own character. Maybe we could learn to question our character, to compensate for it. And so tragedy, Kenneth is bringing up tragedy here, not as, I was watching Star Trek the other day and McCoy said this funny thing. I mean, he's talking about tragedy here because to the Greeks, this is the realm in which you explore what are the natural laws that control the way human beings make choices or notice or don't notice things. And that's what Oedipus is about. It's not some skanky dude who killed his dad and married his mom. It's about the best and brightest and most courageous and compassionate of the people of Thebes, for whom everything went wrong because of what he was missing. So it's the reason why Nietzsche wrote a book called Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks. Nietzsche ties together tragedy and philosophy as being realms that are very closely related. So this is why we're talking about peripeteia, or reversal here. He's saying that it is a fundamental an inescapable, frequent consequence of being mortals that we find ourselves in this state of peripeteia. It's not just something that happens to Agamemnon or Oedipus. They're merely illustrating what's going on in our own character, that we often find ourselves in peripeteia, where our best efforts to make our situation better instead make things worse. I think anybody old enough has gone through some part of their life where they can point to that's exactly, they know this, they felt this, they did this, and afterwards had to look back and say, oh my God, all these things I was trying to do And I thought that it would help, and instead, if only I would have sat still, I could have, at least things wouldn't have got worse. It's like the man in the hole who's really great at digging, and so he thinks the way out of the hole is to dig some more. And instead, the hole gets deeper, and he can't figure out why it's happening. So he's not asking himself the fundamental question about, is this the right tool for the job? Am I the right kind of person to solve this problem? Just like Oedipus doesn't ask himself in Oedipus Tyrannus. So I want a couple of quick links here. These are critically important terms for understanding the human condition from the Greek existentialist perspective. So there's a link to peripateia, and with peripateia is another critical term that Kenneth doesn't say here, but this is how you should read Kenneth. He doesn't have to say it here because the discussion of peripateia comes out of Aristotle's Poetics, where he's discussing how tragedy works. And another key term that comes out of the Aristotle's Poetics is anagonoresis, which is recognition. Recognition and reversal are critical stages in a tragedy. And recognition is the point at which the protagonist finally figures out that things are not going the way he thought they were. And, you know, as Aristotle praises Oedipus Tyrannus, he says there is this state of irony in which it dawns on the viewer long before it dawns on Oedipus that something is completely wrong in the way that the story is unfolding. And so we end up with this horrible irony where we can see something Oedipus can't see. We don't understand it yet, but we know it's not going to be good. And Aristotle praises the fact that in Oedipus Tyrannus, the reversal and the recognition happen at the exact same moment. He says it's a masterpiece to hit them on the same moment. So it is the moment when he suddenly realizes who he is, which he hasn't known all this time. He thought he was somebody else. He thought the people who raised him were his mother and father. He didn't realize his actual mother and father gave him up for a complex variety of reasons, and that he was raised by strangers. And so when he heard the oracle at Delphi all those years ago prophesy that he was going to slay his father, he ran away to make sure he was nowhere near his father. But if he'd left it alone, he would have stayed with the man who wasn't his father. and his father would have been fine. But no, he races across the country to get away from his home, meets his father on the road who doesn't know who he is and ends up killing him in a fight at the ford. Likewise, when he solves the riddle of the Sphinx and frees Thebes from its horrible tyranny, he is made king, and he marries the queen, who is a widow because her husband was slain on the road by bandits, so everybody says. Of course, nobody who's saying that actually witnessed it. They didn't see that it was just one guy on the road. In fact, it was Oedipus who killed his own father, Laius. So all of this stuff happens because he doesn't know who he is. And the moment that he realizes what's wrong in Thebes is the moment that he realizes that what's wrong in Thebes is him. He's what's wrong in Thebes. And that recognition destroys his whole life. It up until then, it was sort of, it was like Wile E. Coyote who has run off the cliff, and as long as he doesn't look down, he can keep running, and he gets close to the cliff on the other side, but then he makes the mistake of looking down, and at that point he stops going forward and just falls, right? This is what happens to Oedipus in Oedipus Tyrannus. The peripateia and the anagonoresis happen at the same moment. And as Stephen points out in the comments, Oedipus had multiple opportunities of growing intensity to make clear to him that things were not okay. But he ignored them every step of the way. So along with these two terms, peripateia and anagonoresis, the other critical term we need here is tragic inversion. And tragic inversion is a term that was, as far as I know, invented by my high school English literature teacher to help him figure out how to teach this stuff. And tragic inversion is the state in which your virtues behave like vices, so that the more you progress, the worse things get. And more importantly, the more virtues you have, the stronger your virtues, the worse the outcome. It's because Oedipus is so great that he makes such a disaster. A mediocre man never could have had the tragedy that Oedipus did. Just like Odysseus wrecks Bronze Age civilization and causes a Dark Age for centuries because he's even smarter than Oedipus. He's the smartest guy ever, Odysseus. And that's why he wrecks everything. His virtues in a state of tragic inversion work not only against him, but against all of civilization. And this is what the Greeks tell themselves over and over as they recite the story of the Trojan War and the story of the returns. So Ari just joined, and I will share the links again in there. But meanwhile, let's see, what time do we have here? Say Phil is supposed to be able to go at 11:44. Oh, not quite yet. Okay, so keep a pin in it, Phil. Hang on to it. Don't lose it. So what Kenneth's talking about here is he's talking about this point of reversal, of peripeteia, in which it becomes clear that you thought you were free, but you're actually a prisoner of your circumstances. And this is why the Greek tragedians talk about one of the key defining qualities of a great tragedy is that it begins in media res. You think you're at the beginning of the story, right? But you're not. You're actually in the middle of the story. And what's going to unfold is that is that the part that you ignored, the part the viewer hasn't seen yet, the past part will turn out to be defining the present and shaping what the future is going to be. And it's only through the process of learning what is that part of the past that has been ignored that's relevant. Only through that process will we be able to finally have some freedom and stop being a puppet that's being driven by the dead hand of the past. This notion is directly stated in a line that goes by from Creon in Oedipus Tyrannus. He says and he's quoting the oracle at Delphi in a rhyme, and the end of the rhyme is the unheeded thing escapes. The thing we didn't look at, that's the part that's going to be devilish. It's our blind spots, the lacunae in our worldview that are going to screw us over. The thing we don't know will turn out to be the defining part of our story. So Fred, welcome to the call. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Just by the by, peripeteia is one of those ancient Greek words that is just rich in meaning and nuance. In my lexicon, the possible translations of peripeteia include, the primary is actually adventure. So some of the translations of peripeteia, depending on context, are adventure, mishap, venture, love affair, and experience. So all those things are kind of bundled up in the notion of peripeteia, and you can draw your own conclusions from that about its applicability to pretty much the whole range of human experience. Thanks.
Thank you, Fred. Yeah, it's part of what's interesting about these studies is that in the modern world we're so used to words having clear meanings. It's just some simple, straightforward Lego type meaning, and you snap the words together to build your sentences. But in these ancient languages like Greek and Latin, more ancient Greek than Latin, but some of each, frequently these words are more like a nexus point where many different things intersect. And you can't bring up the intended meaning of the word without also bringing up all these other unintentional connections that are part of the larger web of meaning. And so I really appreciate that you mentioned that. Fred, for those who just joined us this week, it was Fred about a month ago in our discussion of Oedipus who pointed out that one of the key characteristics of Oedipus that makes him unfit to be king, it's why it's called Oedipus Tyrannus, not king, but tyrant, a distinction Aristotle makes in his work on politics, is that he has a major. It's not just what he doesn't know. He has a major character defect, and the major character defect is that he has thumos. He has anger. He's carrying this huge bundle of rage inside of him. I mean, after all, so the stranger and his guards wouldn't make way for Oedipus at the ford. Why does that mean they have to have a fight? How on earth does that make sense? I mean, just step aside and let the guys by. It's not a big deal. And his father had the same problem. His father also wouldn't step aside and insisted that, Oedipus didn't know it was his father, but Laius insisted that Oedipus stand aside. And so both of them suffered from thumos, which is why Oedipus ends up killing his own father. Every bit as much as his ignorance of who he is, he's bedeviled by this character flaw that he's unwittingly inherited from his from his father. And just to make sure that we get the point that that's not a one-off event, throughout the play that Sophocles gives us, Oedipus Tyrannus, there are multiple occasions when Oedipus loses his temper. He's so like a hunter. He's on the track of who is the wrongdoer who has slain the previous king, and every time someone tries to warn him off or delay his progress for any reasonable reason, he blows his top. He throws a temper tantrum. He's got thumos. So Oedipus Tyrannus is partly named that because of his anger, and the fate that awaits him is again partly because of his anger. If he hadn't been so angry, he never would have slain his father, and then his mother never would have been a widow. And then if Oedipus had solved the riddle of the Sphinx, they would have given him some other reward than to marry the queen. And so again, everything that happened to him is not just his ignorance, but it's also his own character, which he's carrying with us. So, all right. So continuing with paragraph 12, sentences 1 and 2. So he's trying to get us to think about peripeteia, and it makes sense, Fred, that this has also got this larger sense of adventure. It's his life's journey, right, that has led to this point of the point of reversal. Was the inescapable consequence of everything that came beforehand. And this he continues in this: intelligence beclouds itself, and judgment commits itself. And he's describing that as part of peripeteia. Now, intelligence beclouds itself, we all get, but judgment commits itself. Many of us think the whole point of judgment is to commit yourself. You're supposed to say, this guy's guilty and this guy's innocent, or what have you. But in the ancient Greek conception, frequently judgment requires taste. It requires caution. It requires seeing the whole picture and not rushing to judgment. And so committing yourself prematurely can be a disaster. Commits itself to the ruin of its own life is how that finishes, to the ruin of its own life. And this is another aspect of tragedy and of the Greek conception of the human condition. Aristotle doesn't use these words exactly, but he writes to this point over and over in his writings. I did some searching over the weekend, and I found that there's no single quote, although he's often. But to paraphrase him densely, Aristotle says, what's strange, one of the many strange things about the human animal, Homo sapiens, is that most of our problems are not external to us. They might be external to us as an individual, but they don't tend to be external to us as a species. I mean, yeah, the occasional storm or earthquake or volcano or hurricane is going to or plague is going to inflict its stuff on you, and it's not your fault. That's contingency, right? That's tuche, fortune. But an enormous amount of what goes wrong for people is caused either by themselves or by other people or both. He says wars. Aristotle uses wars as an example. And the subtext is, if the Greeks would just stop fighting with each other, their lives would be so much better. And half of what the Greeks struggle with is themselves and their inability to get along with each other. They're just relentlessly going at each other. And that's not inevitable. It's in their nature. It's their character as a people. There could be people elsewhere in the world who don't have half the problem the Greeks do. It is one of the things the Greeks are starting to understand about themselves, is their will to compete too often turns to destructive competition instead of constructive competition. It's like, yeah, you're supposed to stop fighting and go to the Olympic Games and throw the javelin and throw the discus and see who can jump the farthest. You're supposed to do those things to remind you that you don't have to draw your sword and stab the guy. There are other ways to compete that are more constructive. And the Greeks half get this lesson, and they half don't get this lesson. And so there is a strong sense of tragedy to the story of the Greeks. They're raising all of their young under the idea that, our great heroic ancestors had this horrible debacle of their own creation. The Trojan War was the destruction of Greece and ultimately led to the destruction of Bronze Age civilization. And that's why we all became poor and disconnected and illiterate for centuries. And we've spent centuries clawing our way out of our self-made disaster. And so we're going to teach all of our kids, you have a lot of range for freedom, but one thing you must never do is don't repeat those stupid mistakes in which we destroyed everything. And of course, as Thucydides points out in the history of the Peloponnesian War, even though they all know it, they still can't stop themselves from doing it again. It's the horrible tragedy of ancient Greece. So when Kenneth says judgment commits itself to the ruin of its own life, it's not just a sentence. He's referencing, just like Fred pointed out, the web of meaning in peripeteia. Kenneth here is referencing this larger picture. And if you read enough of this book or other things that Kenneth writes, you will start to pick up the way in which, judgment is a loaded term. The ruin of your own life is a loaded phrase. Each of these things carries this larger freight. Geneva, you were going to say something. You want to come off mute and tell us what that is? Got to find your mute button.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't know why my hand kept going up, but I did have a question, because I wanted to ask, without making mistakes, how do you know what the right thing to do is? Because there's choices, and it always seems, for me anyway, that the biggest lessons I learn come from something that doesn't work. So I go down the wrong road, I go down the wrong road, I go down the wrong road, and I finally understand that, okay, this isn't working, I got to try something else. But I wouldn't know that if I hadn't made the wrong choices first. So I just wonder, how do you distinguish, or how does a person distinguish? I think one of the things you were saying is Oedipus couldn't see his flaws. And I wonder, could he see them, or he just didn't recognize what they were when he did see them? I mean, so there's a lot in those statements. So I'm just wondering, how do you figure these things out? And then, of course, there's Hegel with the evolution. with evolution, I've got to stick that in there.
Yes.
So yeah, I just have these questions zooming through my head.
They're great questions, Geneva.
Yeah. Oh.
Thanks for saying them. I mean, because ultimately this is what the Greeks say about this issue. Is they say, on the one hand, yeah, we're mortals, we're going to make mistakes. That's what it means to be mortal. And so there are two strategies one can adopt going forward to mitigate the damage that does to us. And one strategy is, when you make a mistake, notice it, care about it, and learn from it. And Oedipus is not noticing, not caring, and not learning. He's self-blind, right? Until the moment of peripeteia, when he realizes the man he killed at the ford was his father, until that very moment, it never occurred to him that he did something wrong. He thought he was just having an adventure against some bad guys. It didn't occur to him that, yeah, maybe he shouldn't have stabbed the guy just because the guy wouldn't stand aside at the fort. Maybe that's an unreasonable reaction. But imagine if he'd never realized he had thumos until that moment, right? Say he never had an opportunity before that to figure out he had this character flaw. Still, at least he would have had that moment. He should have come away from that going, Jesus, I don't feel good about the fact I just murdered all these guys at this ford. I think there's something wrong with me. I should learn to be calmer. I should learn to, when my anger pops off, I should take a breath and count to 10. And, but if he'd done that, then he would behave entirely differently in the play, Oedipus Tyrannus, where he's constantly losing his temper. He never shows a moment's insight into the fact that he has this recurring pattern. He's self-blind. And I have people in my family who are self-blind. They're brilliant, and they'll question any part of the world except themselves. They have this externality, and this trying to get people to learn to be self-questioning, self-aware, self-critical is why on the Oracle at Delphi, the very first thing you see says, "Know thyself." Thyself. I'm sure you came here with questions about the fate of empires, but don't even enter this thing until you stop and say, have I even questioned myself, searched myself, tried to figure out what sort of character I have? Because if I haven't done that, why should I expect to understand anything that the Oracle's going to tell me? It'll just be a Rorschach test, and I'll miss it all because I'm looking through flawed lenses. So on the one hand, the Greeks believe exactly what you're saying. You're going to make mistakes. It's inevitable. But if you learn from them, then you can get better over time, and you should. And that part of that learning process involves cultivating your own character, You start to see these problems in your character, and then you start to say, I wonder how I could adjust my life to do something about that. And then over time, your character improves. So if Heraclitus's character is fate, the corollary is to change your fate, you have to change your character, which means you got to pay attention to your character. All of this is core Oracle at Delphi stuff. The second half of the answer is this. You don't have to personally make all the mistakes yourself. You could study other people's mistakes. And this is why the Greeks have tragedy, right? Their whole thing is, what are the greatest blunders from Greek history? Let's make plays and popularize them so everybody can go, oh God, Oedipus, of all the mistakes I make in my life, how about I don't kill my father and marry my mother? How about I try not to be, I try not to make or Agamemnon, Aeschylus is Agamemnon. You can learn, where did he go wrong? Where did Odysseus go wrong? Where did all these tragic figures go wrong? And then hopefully the combination of the two means that instead of just repeating history over and over, you can say, well, I have a great collection of things that I'm, to the best of my ability, never going to do. And now I can move on to make my own new, fresh mistakes and learn from them and do better, right? So the Greeks thought the question you're answering is the whole ball game. That this is what it's about. It's trying to get people to do what you're doing. That's the whole game. And the reason that they have so many stories and religious festivals and so on to try to convey that to us is because their observation is, it is weird how hard it is to get people to learn from their mistakes. So many people just don't want to do it. They'd rather deny they made that mistake. I'm not a poo-poo head. You're a poo-poo head. I didn't break that vase. Somebody else, maybe you broke the vase. Anything but admit that they're not a perfect human being, which is strange because why would anybody think a human being is perfect? I mean, what a strange hill to die on. Not me. I never make mistakes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, what's on my mind is sort of somewhat complex. Saturday, which is just 2 days ago, I attended a meeting of Plato's Laws. And I think it really is the balance between mythos and logos. I mean, I think the laws are so different from all the other writings of Plato about philosophy because they were still involved with the balance between mythos and logos. But the laws is about logos itself more than anything else. In some sense, because what you have in the laws is a preamble and the written laws and the statutes that, in a sense, codify the relationship of the society. In some sense, it means that it's restrictive in some sense, but there was also a very important relationship between that and nous. I'm beginning to understand nous better because nous is I guess, the ability for the mind to, in a sense, decipher understanding. And nous is really a attribute to human beings, not so much to the gods, in some sense. And so in some sense, and because human beings do make mistakes, then the nous itself could be somewhat skittish because it's about the human ability to decipher what might come next. And what they would come up next is speculative understanding, because with speculation, you never know what the future is, but you are forced to speculate what is going to happen in the future. And so therefore, this speculative situation, and I was very surprised how detailed the laws were in terms of constructing a society, anticipating the possibilities that might come. But it was not affirmed by what actually happened in the ground first. You could say, but that's all speculative. That just sounds like speculative philosophy in a way. And my thought then wandered to the fact, if that's the case, then in some sense, I asked the question, which came which was more fundamental, the philosophy itself, or actually, in a sense, a global sense of trade? Because in a global sense, trade was very, very important. And what came down with the trade, with the Bronze Age collapse, was trade stopped. So trade has always been a thing that held up, like the the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the whole globe, because it depended on trade to provide the fundamental necessities to sustain, okay, what Steve would say, the meat of existence, if you want to put it that way. And so I wonder, at that point, I was struggling, did the philosophy, in a sense, inspire uh, the economic structure of trade? And therefore, in a sense, they create a kind of parallel structure in terms of trade? Or was it the trade, the marketplace, that actually inspire a kind of philosophical thinking, which is more fundamental in some sense? And because they're based on speculative thing, if you think of the Middle Ages, that's also speculative. We speculate there's a divine God and he gives us all the information. Uh, but in an existential way, we speculate about the economy and how trade happens. And so, in some sense, uh, you would say God is a derivative of philosophy that believes in the gods. And but the economy has its own speculative thing, and that's why we have speculation of the future, pull the economy forward and so forth. In some sense, it almost seems like the economic structure, in some sense, is more fundamental than philosophy. Philosophy is a reflection of, oh, it's going this way, we have to learn how to control it. In some sense, uh, that creates a very interesting thing, because if they both are, of the gods are derivative of human nous thinking about how the possibilities are, and if the economy is the human nous in terms of thinking about how the derivative happened, we are caught in this contemporary societies caught in this derivative morass in which the upper class, upper 1/10 of 1%, is controlling so much of the yield curve than the regular people. I should show you a graph of how different it is in terms of, like, the bottom quintile has hardly gained any wealth whatsoever. The next quintile has gained a little. The third quintile is a little bit more, and the fourth quintile, which would be the upper middle class and the lower upper class, has quite a bit. It's moved up quite a bit. But the top 1/10 of 1%, it's like the curve is like this. It's going straight up. And so therefore, speculative nous in relationship to the economy, uh, which is sort of not derived from God, but from human cleverness, is in some sense ruining human existence in this sense. So in some sense, we need something that will actually control the structure, which means that we have to build it into the governmental structure. But when the government, which is a republic, and what Magnesia was created in Crete, was also a republic, because it wasn't a pure democracy, and it wasn't ruled by the philosopher king or tyrant. In some sense, the rules, the statutes have to do to control what that situation is. And when we let the free market go berserk, then they could buy off all the lawmakers, and they have bought off all the lawmakers, because they want to get rich, and they want, after they leave office, they want to have a cushy job and make more money. So I think term limit, they speculated term limits was important. We have to actually install term limits. Also, how once you leave, you can't just go and make a ton load of money. And so in some sense, to bring it back to harmony, I don't think that you should you need to bring it back to absolute flat line, but it can't go way out of whack as the economy has done. So in some sense, the upper 1/10 of 1% might as well be gods. Might as well be gods, because whatever you do in the market, they could do it 100, 1,000 times better, and they could outspend you and then crush you in the market, because they could manipulate the monetary system while you just sort of, you few dollars, you can't manipulate the monetary system. That's it. I think the Republic is in a lot of trouble because we have news, and news is speculative. And therefore, in a sense, you could speculate in philosophy, which turns out to be metaphysics. You could speculate in the economy with the marketplace, which is the derivatives, the second derivative, and so forth. And in some sense, I think you have to bring that in alignment. So in some sense, not absolutely equal, but not to the degree, maybe to the degree that the third quintile might be okay, but not the fourth, and certainly not the fifth quintile. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. I'm going to steer this back to the text, but my bridge will be the following, which is that as F.M. Cornford says in Thucydides Mythostoricus, the Greeks were very competitive. They liked inequality, but they liked inequality that was in service to competition. They didn't like inequality that crushed competition. And for that reason, even though they liked inequality and competition, they said, in the structure of tragedy, in the structure of things that corrupt human character, extreme wealth and extreme grinding poverty were both terrible things. Neither of them should be tolerated, because they wreck the capacity to compete. And when they wreck the capacity to compete, you no longer can be sure you have a meritocracy. You want a civilization in which whoever is at the bottom, if they turn out to be an astonishingly great person, still has the ability to climb to the top and displace some idiot who's sitting up on top. And if you make the gap too big, then you suppress the person who should be ruling you, who's currently a slave, and you exalt the slavish personality who just happens to be rich. They wanted a wide range of variation, but not so wide that it was impossible to be crossed by a human being. Maybe an exceptional human being, but it should be crossable. They said the point at which the competition breaks down is the point at which the polis begins to degenerate into stasis, and you're headed for civil war and collapse. So they would not have thought kind, flattering thoughts about the way that we've organized the world for now. But that actually works as a great bridge back to the text, because Kenneth, I'm going to go back to sentence 2 again. The stuff that we were talking about before about peripeteia, he says civilizations too experience such ironic reversals. It's not just individuals. We look at these tragic plays and we're inclined to think this is about one guy who did something wrong. But of course, the key to Heraclitus's famous dictum, which I'm going to put right into the text, ethos anthropoi daimon, right? Ethos anthropoi daimon. Character is fate, or a man's character is his guardian divinity. Or another way to put it is that your character rides you like a rider rides a horse. You think that you're freely choosing, but it's your character that's choosing. Your character decided what you even noticed around you and what you didn't notice. You can't think about things you don't notice. And your character picked out for you what was significant. And then it's your character that determines how you feel about those things. Long before you start thinking, is this a good thing that I want or a bad thing I want to avoid? Your character has already decided that part for you. And so our powers of reasoning act within this tight frame that reason itself can't notice, can't detect. And this creates a problem. And this is why this thing is summarized so frequently as character is fate. But as we mentioned before, that translation leaves out the fact that you can change your fate by changing your character. If you become self-aware, self-critical, and you begin cultivating your character, you can change your outcome because you're changing the daimon that's riding on your back. And this is the origin of the thing. If somebody is a drug addict or an alcoholic or just has terrible judgment their whole life long, they always pick the wrong things, people would say he's got a monkey on his back. And that's a reference to this ancient Greek idea that our daimon rides us. And it nudges us so subtly we never notice we have a rider. We think like the horse that forgets it has a rider, we think that we're making a choice when it's actually our character choosing for us. So, but the point is, if you're going to translate a character as fate, you see it says anthropoi. It doesn't say is. Ethos is character, and daimon we can imagine is related to fate. But it's not is in between, it's anthropoi, it's man. Man's character. A man's character is his guardian divinity. But thanks to the ambiguities of the Greek language and its ability to have polyvalent meaning, it also means a people's character is that people's fate or guardian divinity. And it also means all of Homo sapiens, its character, determines its fate. It says all these things at the same time. It's able to operate on the individual level and on the group level. And so when Kenneth says civilizations too experience such ironic reversals, it comes directly from this idea. The story of the man Agamemnon that Aeschylus gives us on the stage is also the story of any human being whose ethos suffers from the same affliction that Agamemnon suffers from. His overweening pride, his need to control and command. Thanks, Ari. I'm glad I just coincidentally got that. Yeah. In fact, grammatically, I can't remember who I was reading. I got to look it up again. I was reading somebody who was doing a run on Heraclitus about 2 months ago, and I was offering new translations and new insights. And I'm just having a blast. I'll go back and pick them up again later. But he points out a number of things that no other translator I ever saw before points out. Ethos anthropoi daimon doesn't have a verb. Ethos is character. Daimon is your daimon, and anthropoi is man. Where's the is? There is no is here. There's no verb at all. In fact, what Heraclitus has, despite all the different ways people translate this, you got to imagine there's a colon instead of a verb. Character, colon, man's daimon. And you'll find that a lot of Heraclitus's really pithy aphorisms have that structure where there's no verb at all. There's an implied colon. It's like he's defining things by putting together, juxtaposing ideas that you never would have thought you could equate with each other. Or like he's putting an equal sign in there. Ethos equals anthropoi daimon, man's daimon. So that's what Kenneth's alluding to. Civilizations too experience such ironic reversals. What happens to Agamemnon doesn't just happen to Agamemnon. What happens to all of these people who get caught in peripeteia and a state of tragic inversion, that's what happens to civilizations. So he continues, it is an acute irony that Greek civilization, which originated in profound aristocratic contempt for inertial idiotia. In other words, for the human condition in which we are trapped in our own perspective, and it causes us to not take control of our lives as individuals. It causes us to just be the ballast of history. We end up just being the symptoms of whatever our parents and our culture poured into us, or whatever we were born with. And it doesn't have to be that way, because we could take command of our character and cultivate a better character. But so rarely do we that, that's why he says inertial. He's talking about this idea of the ballast of civilization, the momentum of a life that's lived without any self-awareness, in which it's just generation after generation play themselves out in a horrible train wreck that, didn't have to be this way. So the Greeks didn't want to be that way. They didn't want to be that way. I'm going to repeat this. I've said it numerous times, but I haven't said it today. And so we've got some newbies. I want to make sure they hear this. There's a book about, it's called Aspects of Death in Early Greek Art and Poetry. It's by Emily Vermeulen. And it's outstanding. It's out of print, but you can find copies in used bookstores. It's outstanding. It quotes all these early poets that most students of Greek never look at. Not like Homer. It's just, lyric poets and so on. And it looks at pictures of vases and bowls and other things that have illustrations of the gods and sometimes have words on them, which we often forget. It's not just pictures. And she explores all the things those early artists and poets had to say about death and what does it mean to be mortal. Which to the Greeks, I know in the modern world we try not to think about death. We try to postpone it. Maybe I'll think about it later. But to the Greeks, this was the critical thing to think about. We are mortal. Our mortality is our defining characteristic. You have to be conscious of it. It's right up there with being an idiot as far as the critical importance of it in our lives. And we have to take it into account and think about what we're going to do about it. And in it, she says the Greeks define mortality differently than we do. We just define it as, oh, we're going to die. That's terrible. And maybe someday medicine will cure this and we can live forever. And Emily Vermeil says, man, the Greeks have a completely different take on this. Yeah, you're going to die. That's the first of 3 critical characteristics that make you immortal. And that's a bummer. But there are worse things, such as the second characteristic, which is that not only do we die, our creative works die. And you think to yourself, well, I might die, but at least I can leave a legacy to go on after me. And the Greeks are like, yeah, but only for a while. You don't know how long. It's not up to you how long that lasts. And this is why Shelley wrote his poem Ozymandias, who had this great monument to himself. But as Shelley says, despite how powerful this Ozymandias must have been, all we see are ruins, and it ends the lone and level sands stretched far away. It's just a desolation where this guy's creative work was, and so much for him and so much for his creative works. And they say, but it's frustrating. You hope that, maybe I can do some good that'll outlive me, and maybe it will, but you don't know how long. It'll eventually die too. They say, yeah, even that's just a bummer compared to the third thing. They said the third part of being immortal is the worst thing of all, which is that to be mortal is to be stupid. We're all stupid. The smartest of us is stupid. And they said, it's not that we like insulting ourselves or each other. It's that it becomes, if you live long enough, it becomes patently obvious how often you get things wrong that you could have got right at a different time. And you think about how often you wake up groggy and you have to remember, where am I? How old am I? What am I doing today? Do I need to find my schedule? Am I scheduled to go somewhere? You can't remember anything. You just have to rebuild your life from scratch every morning. And sometimes it comes to you easily and sometimes it comes to you hard, but we've all been there. And how many times you've been going about your day and you have a nagging feeling you're forgetting something, but it's just like a little buzz and you're into what you're doing, and then you get a phone call and they say, where are you? You say, well, I'm at home. Why you ask? You're supposed to be giving a presentation right now at the hall. And you're like, oh shit, is it Wednesday? Oh no. Suddenly your brain wakes up and goes, oh yeah, I forgot to mention the most important thing about today. I just decided to keep that in my back pocket until it was too late to do something about it. How many times do you walk into a store and you suddenly you were thinking about something else and now you can't remember why you went there? Or you walk into your kitchen and you're like, was I hungry? I think I just ate. Why am I here? These things happen to mortals all the time. It's one of the mistakes Kenneth sometimes makes, and it's not a big mistake. The Greeks, Homer talks, he calls Homo sapiens ephemeroi, creatures of a day, ephemeroi. And Kenneth often translates that as that's because we're going to die. But according to Emily Vermeil, who says, by the way, many classicists get that wrong. So the lyric poets are crystal clear that what they mean is we're that stupid. We spend the day learning and thinking and remembering who we are and getting into what we're doing, and then we go to sleep. And we wake up the next day and we have to start all over again. And it helps that our unconscious carries over some of yesterday. And so we can learn and get back up to speed faster in general. But we still have to do it. And they say, it is just deeply frustrating. And anybody can imagine what it would be like if you woke up in the morning remembering everything. Because we wish we could. Right, so it's called Aspects of Death in Early Greek Poetry and Art. And you'll want to Google that. It's not available for free. You have to find yourself a copy. It's available in paperback or hardback. There's plenty of them around. I've got one. But yeah, she says these are the 3 defining characteristics of what it means to be mortal. And they say moderns think the worst thing is that you die. But the Greeks thought it was far worse that your creative works die. And they thought it was far, far, far worse that we're so stupid. Emily Vermeil says, and I love the way she writes this. She says, and of these 3 things, they hated most being stupid. So the Greeks hated being stupid. They hate it about themselves. Why are we so dumb? You know, we hear this contempt that the Greeks have for other civilizations. They call them barbarians. They say their language is stupid. They just say bar, bar, bar all the time. And we go, oh, they're just being ethnocentrist. And she's like, no, man. They worked so hard on their language to turn it into an instrument that could help them be less stupid that they held in utter contempt civilizations that just took their language for granted. What? I learned how to speak just as good as anybody else. It's like, yeah, but the people you're around are all dummies. Make your language better. You need a better prosthesis for your puny mortal brain. And the way we know is our puny mortal brains drive us up the wall. And so you should do the same thing, but instead you're all just complacently taking your language for granted as though what? God himself designed your language to be a perfect carrier for all the things you're supposed to remember? No. Nobody did that. You got to do that. Just like you're supposed to cultivate your character, you should be cultivating your language. And so when they called other people barbarians, they meant they don't even cultivate their language. It just is whatever it is. They can't think the things that they don't have words for, and they don't notice or care. It's like, this is a state of barbarism. And we think it's because they're ethnocentric and love themselves so much. But meanwhile, here are the Greeks going, why are we so stupid? You know, it's like it brings into focus this misanthropy, which students of the Greeks often bring up. Why do they seem to be? We're in modern English, we're so used to cheerleading ourselves all the time. We're number one. America's the greatest. Blah blah blah. It's hard for us to imagine a people that's like, oh my God, what is wrong with us? We're so dumb. We're like, oh, that makes no sense. That's some kind of weird alien species. That's not a human thing to do. So anyway, this is what I'm going to call on Stephen in just a second, but this is what he's talking about when he says profound aristocratic contempt for inertial idiotia. It's not just that they think slaves are dumb, although you'll find plenty of examples where they have stupid comedies where they're poking fun at slaves, even though they themselves made those people slaves, and maybe those people would have been geniuses under different circumstances. They don't know, but they think they do. Everybody's got their blind spots and their prejudices. But the Greeks mostly are applying this contempt to themselves. And this is why the core of philosophy is that you learn these techniques not so that you can win a debate, but to use them against yourself. You're stuck in a labyrinth and you can't even see it. And so you're supposed to be, the Greeks expect that you're supposed to be wielding these tools of philosophy to get some leverage against the problems you're carrying around with you as your freight. Kafka says a very great Greek thing when he says, a book must be an ice axe to break up the frozen sea within you. Our opinions ossify and get stuck, and we stop being alive to what's happening around and within us. And Kafka says, you can only hope that you'll encounter a book that will shake all that up and bring you back to life again. You go, oh shit, did I fall asleep? Was I sleepwalking through the last decade? Maybe I can wake up and start gardening again. Yeah, this is the kind of contempt. This is what he means by contempt here. This paragraph 12 may be a summary paragraph, but Kenneth is really pulling all the strands together into some new dense language here. And as you, for those of you who are new to Kenneth, as you get experience with him, you'll come to understand. So idiotia is a loaded term. Idiota, one's own. He's talking about the human condition. And inertial, he's not just throwing that on as a flavor word. He's talking about the horrible momentum of people who don't question themselves. And then their lives are more like a cannonball fired through the air with no more control over their direction than the cannonball has once it leaves the cannon. And likewise, aristocratic. He's not saying hoity-toity, full of themselves people. That would be oligarchic contempt. He's making the same distinction Aristotle makes. Aristocratic means the contempt that somebody who is desperate to do better has for the parts of themselves that are worse. When I don't hold other people who are alcoholics in contempt, but I hold my own alcoholic gene in contempt. So I don't ever want to listen to its siren song. I want, if some part of me, if I smell a glass of wine and my mouth involuntarily waters, I don't want to say, oh, apparently I want that, so I guess I have to drink it. I want to feel like if somebody offered me a dog turd. Contempt. I want to be like, absolutely not. Fuck you, buddy. I am not touching that thing. And this is what the Greeks are. The aristocratic thing they're talking about is the part of themselves that is constantly singing the siren song, saying, "Come on, it'll be nice, be a lotus eater." They want to develop that contempt for that part of themselves and say, "Absolutely not. Get away from me, you part of myself. Go sit in the corner and think about what you've done wrong. I do not want to be that person, or I will never actually, be able to live the life of an Aristos." This phrase, profound aristocratic contempt for inertial idiotia, also has implicit in it one of the things Kenneth Smith says a lot, which is Sisyphus is not pushing a boulder up the hill for all eternity as a punishment. He's pushing the boulder up the hill because he's an Aristos. And if you want to do better than your slavish, most bestial, or most ideologized self, if you want to rise out of those two half-witted seductions that are built into our character, then you're going to spend the rest of your life fighting these two gravity wells. You're going to be pushing a boulder up the hill. But that's the reward. You may not get it all the way up the hill, but you're not at the bottom anymore. You're making a little bit of progress inch by inch. You're getting out of the muck and the mire of the worst parts of your own character. And that's what it is to be an Aristos, which is why the name Sisyphus means he who has the most taste, judgment, the heuristic qualities. So you've always got to be fighting that inertia. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I was going to go back to Kierkegaard, who's been forgotten. I was exploring some of these issues around Kierkegaard, and this picture he had of the esthetic, Smith is calling it pagan here, but I began to pick up that it's involved with the life stages, like the ancient Romans believed you were a kid up until you're 21. Then you were a youth from 21 to 42. And only after 42 could you become a senator. And that was your prime of life when you were a senator, but then another 21 years and 63 and you're into the old age period. Now, I think what Kierkegaard was in his own personal struggle. And when he talked about the aesthetic life, he was talking about the life of a child. Kids have to grow through the aesthetic. They have to be egotistic. They have to be idiots to begin to feel their own nature. But when you go past 21, Kierkegaard would say that you're coming to another phase of life where you've got to start to take on some adult responsibilities. This is equivalent to the youth phase. So you're not a senior, but you're a junior. Because Kierkegaard didn't want to take on the adult responsibilities. He didn't want to do what his family wanted him to do, who were always involved in the priesthood. His family wanted him to get married and they'd find him a nice little parsonage somewhere. And so Kierkegaard talks about, this immersion in the aesthetic, that he was one of these people. It's like Schopenhauer, who talks about how he was hypnotized by an artwork. These are people, Schopenhauer's another one, he doesn't get married. He doesn't want to take on adult responsibilities. He wants to be in an eternal state of childhood. And there's plenty of people around like that. I'm one. I've just noticed it, that's all. Now, Kierkegaard talks about when you go beyond the aesthetic, he talks about the aesthetic stage of being the stage of recollection. And then he talks about the adult, this young adult phase as being the cycle of repetition. Now, he's pointing out something here, that you don't really rise to ethos until you're an adult. It's as a young adult that you start to discover what ethos means. It means doing your duties, carrying out your responsibilities, which a kid doesn't want to do. our society is full of people who will work for a living, but really they would rather defer the adult responsibilities to government or to somebody else. I'd rather handball my responsibilities to somebody else. I'd rather somebody else gives me direction in life. I live as an adult, but I'd rather follow somebody else with their ideas about responsibility so I can enjoy all the aesthetic things like having a six-pack and a fishing rod somewhere out in the country. Now, we see a bit of this in Oedipus, that he's still young. He's still so engrossed in himself. And, you know, when he sees a man get in his way of his rise to power, hey, dude, out of my way. And when he gets power, it's been so easy. But he fails to look at the complexities when you're involved with yourself as a kid, the idiota. It's all very easy and all very simple in a way. But as an adult, you start to have a requirement to become aware of things outside your ken, to rise above the aesthetic, to the repetition phase. I had a little thing there which demonstrated the two stages, although Kierkegaard also would talk about the free stages. But, you know, this sort of brings up the point of what could be going on. So this is very much my life. You know, I didn't want to take on adult responsibilities. I just wanted to keep on being a kid and feel all the refined things like, you know, artistic places and looking at, you know, wonderful things. And there must be some sympathy in that regard in the audience, that they're you know, the issues around melancholia, for example, that if you dwell on the past, you'll tend to become melancholic in your moods. But, you know, you feel a great desire to go to those things which you saw as a kid. You know, if there was like a museum, if you loved going through the museum as a kid, you'll go back there as an adult and try to relive the recollection, the childhood phase. So Kierkegaard's pointing this out about himself. So unfortunately, I had to talk a long time. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I'm about to dive into a deep Kierkegaard study. I think I have to, in order to do justice to this middle section of the book, because Kierkegaard is so focused on the religious life as being a superior level of existence than the aesthetic. And the religious life is the centerpiece of the medieval worldview. It's how they think they're going to solve the problems of the corruption of the ancient world. For those who are just joining us, this week, the key contradiction here is that the ancients believe that nature has solved problems, resolved conflicts, and created a viable, sustainable cosmos in a way that human societies haven't done yet.
Kind of relation.
And so, therefore, if we want to make human societies work better, we should model them on nature. And they claim to have done that. But by the time of the late Roman Empire, everybody can see that that's clearly not the case. If they have succeeded in modeling human society on nature, then nature can't be trusted. And if they have not succeeded in modeling human society on nature, then human beings can't be trusted because they're bad modelers. But either way, nobody could call the city of man, as Augustine calls it, as evidenced by the late Roman Empire. No one could call that desirable. It's a disaster. It's just a nest of corruption. And so the medieval critique is that the problem is that we are choosing between two corrupt sources of meaning. Either nature is corrupt or human beings are corrupt. But either way, attempting to use nature as a source of how to make a better world for human beings is failing. And in their place, the medievals offer God. Say, God is not corrupt. God is all good. He's all knowing. He's all powerful. He's everywhere. He is the one uncorrupt thing. And why on earth would we not want to model our societies on what God tells us to do? That's obviously the thing to do. To fix the problem of corruption of the ancient world, we're going to substitute the old system of meaning. We're going to replace it with, just absolute adherence to what God wants. And that should work. And as a revolutionary idea during a time of complete rot, the late Roman Empire, it's a great idea. You could see why it would catch on. So it's core to the medieval ethos that we're going to put religion at the center and God at the top, and that's how we're going to structure society. Thus, the divine right of kings in Europe, or the mandate of heaven in China, and similar things elsewhere. This idea of we're going to connect to the pure good thing, and it's going to guide us. But of course, the problem is by 1,000 years later, we can see that instead, the medieval epoch has managed to recreate the corruption of the late Roman Empire, but now within a regime that was supposed to be dedicated to God. And how that happened and why that happened is the whole basis of the Reformation and struggle. So Kierkegaard, as somebody who's taking Hegel, he's taking what Hegel has written, which is profoundly insightful, and then he's saying, let us delve deeper into these problems of human character. And let's do it within the context of religion. And say, what does the Hegelian dialectic of Geist, the mind or spirit, what does it have to teach us about the nature of authentic religion versus hypocritical religion? How can we make this all work? So he takes Hegel's Begriff and Verstand, the two naive forms of existence, the half-witted modes, where Begriff is cleaving unto a naive form of gnosis, but is eschewing noesis. That is to say, the experiential feeling life, live each day as though it's your last. That's core to this part of the aesthetic personality, the naive beginning part. But it leaves out all the planning and thinking and education and systematizing that we're used to in the modern world. And so Hegel and Kierkegaard agree it's a problematic mode of life. But the problem is that when people develop the next stage of the mind, they do so by negating that earlier stage in disgust. They're like, it's so stupid if you just get angry and just lash out when you're angry. It's so stupid if you don't learn to control your feelings. It's so stupid if you don't get educated. Learn something, for God's sake. Go ahead and learn how the world works. Learn how systems work. If you want to build a house, don't just grab a bunch of lumber and throw it in a pile and then have a tantrum because it doesn't self-assemble into a house. Study under carpenters and learn how to do it and develop your skills.
Could I interrupt?
Yes.
Well, I'm not sure all the Greeks were saying Greeks were stupid. I think we're talking about a small minority of philosophers.
Yes.
And the first thing the rest of the Greeks will do when they hear them telling them they're stupid is they'll do to them what they did to Socrates.
That's exactly right. Of course. I'm doing Aristotle's trick. It says, you want to characterize a people, you characterize it by its strong suit. When it's at its best, what is it? And you're right, it's misleading to do it that way because it ignores the fact that the Greeks struggled relentlessly with people who didn't want to take in these ideas. But what I'm doing at the moment is bringing Kierkegaard.
I will add something further.
Yeah, go ahead.
The Greeks' great product was rationality. And who better than the Greeks who, in their idiot nature, are born the most irrational people around? But the lesson to be rational was best in them. Think, if a Greek went to Phoenicia or to Palestine or to Egypt, what the Semitic peoples would think of a Greek. These guys are crazy.
Yes, for sure. So the equation, I'm building on what Stephen said, the equation I'm trying to make here is that Hegel's Begriff, which is the wholly immediate, immersive, experiential feeling life, is the beginning of Kierkegaard's aesthetic personality. And Kierkegaard's aesthetic personality isn't just one of these stopping points. It describes the whole journey of transformation out of Begriff and into Verstand. All of that falls within the aesthetic personality. And the Verstand that we're talking about here, for those who weren't here previously, Verstand is the intellectual life, the educated life, the trained life. You become a great carpenter by studying the techniques of carpentry, the patterns of carpentry. You systematize your understanding of the world, and in return, you get power. Right? You get this abstraction. You learn to look at all situations with wood from an abstract perspective in terms of what you can do with it and how you can manipulate it. And it offers you great power, but in return, unfortunately, it disconnects you from the juices of life. You start to have trouble with motivation. You start to have depression, anomie, a lack of get up and go, because the things that make us feel alive are our feeling experiences, right? It is our love and our wonder and our anger and our grief. These are the things that bring us to life. And the more we push away gnosis and isolate ourselves within the ivory tower of noesis and all the skills we have, the more we're cut off from those authentic emotions and experiences. And life becomes a flatland of techniques and social climbing. And that's the curse of Verstand, of what Kenneth Smith calls the banausos. He gets this power to manipulate the world, but at the cost that nothing really matters anymore, and he becomes a nihilist. And all of this is captured by Kierkegaard's aesthetic personality stage, that whole journey from the one to the other. And then atop that, he erects a new state of personality, which he calls the ethical. And the ethical stage of personality, I think, corresponds to Hegel's Vernunft. Hegel's Vernunft is, if the banausos, if the person trapped in Verstand, in noesis, if they can get to the point where they understand that they're trapped by their overcommitment to one side of their mind, then they can try to reconcile the tension between gnosis and noesis and have a life that has both of them in it. So that, yeah, they can study Latin, but they can also dance and sing. That they could learn how to work spreadsheets, but they can also learn how to do art. That they can try to reintegrate the denied part of their personality, the part that, according to Hegel, they negated when they became a hyper-intellectual. They can try to grow back together into a whole person. And Hegel says this is the adult, mature mind that Homo sapiens is supposed to develop into. The other two are just developmental stages along the way, like Stephen alluded to when he gave the various ranges of age, right? Talking about stages of development. Hegel's arguing that Vernunft, this whole-minded dialectical mode, is the adult stage. And as far as I can tell, I haven't done my deep dive on Kierkegaard yet, but as far as I can tell, the ethical stage of development, the ethical personality, is what he maps onto Vernunft, Hegel's Vernunft. But it leaves the problem. What does he think the dialectic is within the ethical personality that necessitates a third, higher synthesis up above? I guess that's a second synthesis up above, which is his religious personality, because he's very clear that the religious personality is a higher stage of development than the ethical. This is Kierkegaard's argument. First, we have the struggle at the aesthetic level, and then if we can, we grow up to the ethical level. But he argues there's a struggle there too, and I haven't read either or yet, so I can't tell you what he thinks that struggle is. But he thinks that struggle is resolved through arrival at the religious personality. And this is Kierkegaard's attempt to reconcile the Hegelian philosophy of the mind with his own attachment. He is a deeply religious guy. This is how he tries to work them together. And in this way, he's essentially, Bach did his greatest works of Baroque composition after the Baroque era was basically over. Everybody else is pretty much done and was moving on to classical when J.S. Bach is writing these masterpieces of Baroque. And everyone keeps looking over and go, why is he still doing that stuff? I mean, it is amazing. We can say eight-part improvisations. Nobody's ever done that before. On the one hand, it's amazing. But on the other hand, isn't it passé? But, this kind of takes us back to Hegel's the owl of Minerva only takes flight with the fall of night. And so here it is with Kierkegaard. We're well past the medieval epoch. Kierkegaard is a modern philosopher. He's 19th century. And yet he is trying to put the medieval worldview on a better footing. in which all of the Hegelian dialectic of the mind and history is incorporated in such a way that attachment to God, which the medievals saw as the highest achievement and the way that the problems of the old order were going to be solved, Kierkegaard's trying to put this into a strong dialectical framework. So I need to do this reading. I haven't done it yet. I only know a bit of Kierkegaard. And I think I need to start by following in Sharon's footsteps, and I'm going to order myself a copy of Kierkegaard for beginners. Because I just I want to go through that and I might have read it 35 years ago, but I don't remember any of it now. So I'm getting all my Kierkegaard secondhand through Kenneth. Phil, come off mute. Yeah, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, the first thing I want to mention is I put the graph of the spread of wealth, so everybody knows. I put the graph on, and you could inspect it yourself. The next thing I want to say is that the dialectic is kind of interesting because, in some sense, the ultimate, I guess, affirmation of the Middle Ages is Saint Anselm, right? If there was a God, the perfect God would have to exist, right? If he doesn't exist, then it's just imagination. So therefore, but that is an idea that's a metaphysics. In other words, it's a circular argument that starts out with existence is being, but in some sense, that existence is a phenomenological being rather than an existential being. So in some sense, it's kind of funny because, yeah, why don't you prove that God exists rather than just proclaiming God exists? And so once you start out with that argument, it's like, and you believe in it, then in a sense, there must be a God. Because if there isn't a God, then God doesn't exist, and you don't want that to be the case. But it's a circular argument that actually turned into a metaphysics rather than an ontology. The ontology is to go and find God. I mean, I suppose you could say, well, didn't Moses find God? He was a burning bush. No, but that's a story. That is not finding God. And so in some sense, yeah, if that's the case, then the whole thing is based on a kind of hypothesis of God existing, and that's an absolute thing. And so in some sense, it's a circular argument, a perfect circular argument that just leans on one side, which is metaphysics and analytics. And you suppose to go to the other side as well and say, find them in existence, existentially. So in some sense, if that's the case, then the whole Middle Ages is built on that argument, and that argument, actually, there is no proof that God exists. Okay, not absolute proof. It's just assertions. Other people say, well, I believe God exists. Okay, they could go ahead and believe that, but belief is not reality, is not actuality, it's a belief. Like I have many beliefs, and I'm wrong in many of them. So in some sense, so that's a one-sided argument, so it becomes a problem. And I think when you build it on that problem, then if you can't produce the proof, then in some sense, the whole thing collapses because it's one-sided. It's just as much one-sided, as the Benalsos who just will say, oh, I think things are working out fine. So you have to actually congeal these two, both the thinking, the metaphysics. One of the other things that I want to mention is also, we know in contemporary brain development that in some sense we create our own destruction because we know that the brain is developed. Part of the brain is it has, because there's not enough room, you have to prune the bush to create the pathway to a more efficient development. And the problem is that needs culture. In other words, that needs education. That needs mom and pop guiding you in a social way, because if you're just a kid, you don't know what to prune, right? So it really depends on education system, first beginning with the parents, and then an education system that actually teach you how to behave in the right way. So in some sense, you become a more developed human being. And part of the problem, as Steve mentioned, is if we don't have that education, by the time we get to 18 or 21 or whatever the age is, then you are already like lost, because nobody helped you to prune in the right way. And you got little tiny rows leading all over the place, and you're very, very confused. Or else you prune in the wrong way and you prune out the express highway. You got all sorts of little roads that is very diverse, but it doesn't get you anywhere. You end up exactly where you are. So you have to have a relationship between the dialectic of analytical language and poetic language. In other words, that is what allows a language to, in a sense, infiltrate both aspects, and you have a dialectic going. And I think any kind of one-sided argument is one-sided, is not a duality. I'll just mention in brief, I think I mentioned this before. You all know what a bell-shaped curve is. We all know that. And the bell-shaped curve, what Hegel did was, in some sense, in culture, that it could move one direction and another direction, but it never gets out of bounds. And so therefore, even the bell-shaped curve in a certain way, and there are people at the other end, they don't disappear. They're kept in, and that because culture could move the other way. And so there's always a relationship between the bell-shaped curve. And the problem with when it hardens is like the bell-shaped curve suddenly flatline in the middle, there's nothing, and there are now two bell-shaped curves. And once you develop the two bell-shaped curves, there is no middle. And therefore, there's going to be a fight, first in arguments, and then actually war. This is what happened in January 6th. Nobody agrees with anybody else. The middle is lost. And, we all think that there are two parties in America. That's not true. There's three parties in America. The Democrats, the Republicans, and the independents. And the independents have a way of influencing the election. But when the bell-shaped curve move apart, then the independents no longer exist, because you have to choose a side. There is no middle, right? So once you have to choose a side, then in a sense, the marginal elector becomes a deciding factor. And once you do that, it's kind of like gas price or housing price. The marginal person, in a sense, sets the price for everything. And so when you lost the middle, then there's conflict, because nobody agrees on anything. And that's a dangerous situation. That is a situation that we're not only rapidly moving toward in our country, but we are moving toward in a global situation. I am dreadfully afraid that there will be a war. There's certainly an economic war going on right now. And the next stage is a hot war, And when you get to the point, let's say, one of the sides can't do it economically, let's bring out the ships and the airplanes, and we will decide this on the battlefield, War, hot wars will mediate the solution. And that's where the problem, when you have a split in the middle. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Well, I was going to talk a little more about Kierkegaard, but I think I'm going to take us back to the text instead. So I think Kierkegaard will keep coming up here. He's going to be the ghost that haunts all this discussion, and he's going to come to the foreground. So back to the text. Paragraph 12. We're trying to get through paragraph 12 and out of chapter 7 and into chapter 8. So he says, civilizations to experience such ironic reversals. It is an acute irony that Greek civilization, which originated in profound aristocratic contempt for inertial idiotia, in spite of itself ultimately propagated a hardened and pathological form of idiotism in the form of highly sophisticated politics and philosophies of the sophists. So here he's counterposing sophistry against philosophy. And there's a number of ways in which it works. But one of them is the idea that if you're wielding these techniques against yourself to break up your assumptions and see a larger world that's possible, then it might be philosophy. But if you're just using them to win arguments and gain status, then it's sophistry. And sophistry is in this way a corruption of philosophy. It reduces it to techniques for winning. As some of the sophists basically bragged, you pay them money and they will teach you how to make the worse argument seem like the better argument. They're there to destroy the capacity to understand the world so that you can win. You know, what should be happening is that these techniques should be being used to distinguish the worse and the better from each other so that we can pursue the better argument. But the sophists are destroying that for money, right? This is how they make their living. And the crime of which Socrates is convicted and for which he is executed is corrupting the youth, and it's exactly sophistry that they have in mind. That's what they're accusing him of, because it's so widespread. Everybody's seeing that the youth of today are behaving very differently. They're not pursuing the good. They're not pursuing what's good for the civilization. The civilization is in trouble. Now, whether they had the right solution is a whole other thing, but this is what's on their mind. And Kenneth Smith is underscoring this idea. He's basically agreeing with F.M. Cornford and Thucydides that there's something broken in the character of Athens that leads them into the Peloponnesian War. Their character has rotted out from under them long before they actually engaged in the terrible behavior. It was first their character went, and then that changed the way they saw the world. And then seeing the world differently, they began acting differently. So there's a feedback loop, but the feedback loop is being driven by these problems in character. And the sophistry he's talking about here, he's talking about the middle class, which in the Greeks is not equivalent to the U.S. middle class. It's banauseia, the form of existence in which you have become highly verstand, highly intellectualized and educated. You have given up begriff. You no longer attach yourself to what's important. You attach yourself to how to win. You disregard feelings, you disregard experiences, you disregard whether other people are real people and they're your friends and you ought to be working together to create a civilization that works. And you start thinking, how do I beat that guy? What is it going to take to beat him? How do I humiliate him and make myself feel great? How do I make more money? All of this stuff is these are the flaws that banauseia is prone to, because banauseia abstracts itself from the matrix of tradition and value systems and becomes entirely a creature of the game system of how to win. So this is when he's talking about propagating a hardened and pathological form of idiotism. On the one hand, he's alluding to the sophists and he names them by name. But on the other hand, if Donald was here, he would totally agree. You can absolutely, if you know Kenneth's writing, you will absolutely recognize that he's talking about this terrible thing the Greeks gave birth to. It's banauseia. When the Greeks are writing early on, they don't entirely understand fully how the banausoi are different from the douloi and how the banausoi are different from the aristoi. They're very clear about the difference between douloi and aristoi. But the banausoi sort of shift around. Sometimes they treat them like slaves and they won't let them vote. Sometimes they treat them like aristoi because they pursue excellence in their own weird way. And the Greeks are confused by them. And part of the way that the Greeks learn that the Banausoi are their own third character type is by the way that after Solon revises the constitution of Athens and he gives the vote to the Banausoi then corrupt Athens and lead them into the Great War that destroys, basically just first wrecks Athens, ultimately leads to the downfall of Greek civilization until they're conquered by Philip of Macedon. So this is the thing they gave birth. They learned too late that they had a viper in their nest. This sometimes kind of sums it up this way. It took them too long to figure out what their actual circumstances were. So he then continues, it proved to be indeed a masterful, insuperable form of egocentrism and self-interest that finally commandeered Greek aristodemocracy for its own submoral purposes. So, you know, he's giving us a summary here. And then finally, he brings us back around to the medieval with the next few sentences when he says, and Christianity too, which originated in utter revulsion for the natural selfishness that defines almost all human moral psychology, would likewise ultimately yield hardened and sophisticated species of vicious egocentrism that would triumph altogether over the ethos of Christian spirituality, would in truth kill God himself. And so here he's talking about, you know, what a horrible irony it is that over the 1,000-year course of the medieval civilization, it starts out with its aspiration being to put an end to corruption. But by the end of its period in the 1400s, 1500s, it's now become the ultimate form of corruption on the planet. And, you know, if you're looking for a tragedy, that's a gigantic tragedy at a civilizational level. And you remember how he started this paragraph. It's not just individuals that can experience peripateia. This is the peripateia of the medieval epoch, that it ends this way, when this was the one thing it didn't want to do. And this should echo for us in our minds the way that the one thing the Greeks didn't want to do was repeat the catastrophe of the Trojan War and destroy Greek civilization, which is exactly what they do in the Peloponnesian War and the succeeding civil wars that follow, until finally they have to be defeated by the Macedonians and governed from outside, because they can't govern themselves. They can't stop themselves from tearing at each other. The nekos, the centrifugal force, is too strong in their character, and they don't know how to stop it. They don't know how to stop ripping themselves to pieces. So they have to be ruled by somebody who can keep them from doing it. And then to finish this three-part comparison, and by the way, in these chunks in paragraph 12, he's basically summarizing the entire book, but in such a nucleated form that you can't infer the rest of the book from it, but he's kind of summarizing, saying, so too the modern epoch, conceived in license, if not liberty, has more and more deeply immired itself in addictions, compulsions, and pathetic and slavish delusions, all for the lack of the values from which it deemed it was emancipating itself. Before I do the final sentence there, I just want to come back to point out, again, if you're new to Kenneth Smith, pathetic, he doesn't mean despicable. He means the Greek term pathos, which is something that you can't control. Or maybe you could if you were different, but the way that you are, you've made yourself subject to it. And so you just have to suffer it. It's the parts of life that aren't within your sphere of influence, things you can't control. So pathetic and slavish delusions, he's talking about, you know, being in a state of pathos in which you are a slave to your delusions. Rather than controlling your ideas and ruling them, you're letting your ideas rule you. Whether that idea is democracy or capitalism or order versus chaos or whatever the ideology of the modern world is that you might think about, it has this ruling power over us because we take it for granted, like the fish assume water. And then we're not able to question it. And because we can't question it, we end up just being subject to it. That's the pathos. And he blames this on the emancipation that moderns have from values, which is there used to be things that were unthinkable that you should never do. But moderns believe nothing should be unthinkable. We think that we should get together in our marketplaces and in our parliaments, and we should decide for ourselves how we want things to go. And everything is on the table. Nothing is forbidden. If the group decides that cannibalism is in, then it's in, because that was what the group decided. This is modernity in a nutshell. There are no values that take priority over our deliberations and decisions. Human ego is now the God. Whatever it decides as a group or with enough money or enough guns, whatever it decides, that's what we'll do. Nothing can hold it in check. In fact, modernity is all about liberty. So we believe nothing should hold it in check, right? Freedom, 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 freedom. We don't ask ourselves, freedom from what? Freedom for who? Is this Ted Bundy insisting on freedom so that he can kill more people? What, freedom should be questioned. But in modernity, we're just supposed to chant it over and over and never ask ourselves, if the free market is free, what's it free from? What's it free to do? Isn't slavery part of the free market? Because now it's not holding itself back from enslaving other human beings? Isn't corrupting all of our churches and turning them into outgrowths of the market, isn't that freedom for the market? Because no longer will it be just one part of our culture, it'll now be in control. It'll be our substitute for a culture. We'll just believe that the market will solve all our problems, which it was never meant to do. Now, these are the sorts of questions that you can't ask if you take for granted all the things that you're taught in school about how the invisible hand of the marketplace will magically solve all our problems, and about how people are reasonable and they will pursue enlightened self-interest. Like, on what planet will that happen? Not this one. He then concludes, civilizations at their peripateia, their reversal, begin to metamorphose into their antitype, the very thing that they rebelled against, that justified the creation of the new epoch, the old order that was so rotten. By the end of the new order, it has become the old order again in new clothes. The corruption has risen to the fore again. Blindly to love and become what they once despised. And that's how he wraps up chapter 7. And he's not saying that this always has to happen this way. He's saying in European history, we have documentation for 3 out of God knows how many epochs. And there's epochs from different worldviews from all over the world, from all different kinds of periods. And we just don't have documentation on most of them. And this book takes an entire book just to cover these 3 in Europe. But the implication is that we should then go on to do more of this and look at the possibilities and not just assume that what we have seen in our tiny, narrow slice of the world and its history represents the limits of what people can be or can do. Anytime people say people are always like that, no one could do any better, I hear the ideology speaking. To make that statement, to say that people can't be any better than this, is to say that you personally witnessed all 300,000 years of the species' history. You were there. You know nothing better has ever been done. But of course, that's claiming to be a god. I'm no god, and I'm pretty sure you're not a god either. So, this is what he's warning us about. He's saying, we see this pattern being repeated in European history, and we got to ask ourselves what the possibilities are without starting out by assuming that we already know. You start out, we're assuming we already know, we're just engaging in sophistry. But if we genuinely ask what might be possible, now we might be doing something philosophical. And this is where chapter 7 ends. Shall we move on to chapter 8, start medieval civilization 4? Aha, Optimus has comments. Come off mute. Ari, tell us what's on your mind.
I have, I'm sure I'll tickle Stephen with this. It's a highly reduced idea, but I'm sure, at least I believe, I posit that it has good merit. So anyways, it's food for thought. And it goes something like this, that essentially, as Stephen was saying, that the Greeks manufactured this great thing called rationality and reason, which is essentially like abstraction. And I understand abstraction also etymologically being to like extract. And essentially, it sounds to me like what happens is abstraction is to individuate. And the way you go from being just in a polis to, which is a mythos version of this, would be the mythos is how we come together through a shared narrative, but the logos is how we sort of personally relate or make up our own framework. But essentially, the more you abstract is the more to isolate yourself. And it seems like that you have this tension between essentially gnosis and noesis. And the logos is this idea of abstraction. That's where you're going to get this individuation, and that essentially that like the guy who's digging and can't figure out why he can't dig himself out of the hole because every time he tries to dig, he just delves in deeper. It's like this idea to we're thinking too much, and we're overthinking. So the only way out of this is to think more is the exact opposite, right? So it almost seems like to be stuck in abstraction is to be hyper individuated, at least as it would be that it's a centrifugal force, centripetal. It's the one that I'm getting these two confused temporarily, which one spins you apart. But to some degree, you want to be slightly apart, or at least in a healthy Sophrosyne level of individuatedness, an I versus a we is the language that I would use. But to abstract is essentially how you cultivate an I. And in this hyper individualistic society that we have, and also what was seeming to happen to the Greeks as they were pulling apart with too many ideas, is they were stuck in hyper abstraction and they lost their their gnosis. They lost their mythos. And to some degree, you could say the same with us now. We don't have a shared narrative. We don't have a gnosis, an embodied sense of this, of being in the world. And therefore, you get stuck in abstraction and you just hyper individuate. And this creates what I would say is really an argument for this. I forget which one is the Dule, the Banausoi, but the sophist, essentially, who's just trying to win. Well, this is essentially using philosophy. Which one? You're saying
Banausos.
Banausos, right? This is a hyper individual. He just wants to win, and essentially he's using the toolkit of philosophy, which is really philosophy is for the polis, is the original sense of the virtues are all in the service of the polis. But he was an individual using them for his own gain. This is a person who's a slave to his individuality, and essentially he's a hyper individual. And you could say to some degree maybe about the slave who's just a slave to their biology, to their feelings, the douloi who are just ephemerally in the griff, right? But it's like maybe there's two different forms of I don't really know if how the griff gets in this individual, because you could also be a slave to whatever the group, like a mob is just in the griff, right? So I don't know if the dichotomy holds so well, and this needs some development. But there's definitely something to this idea that the more you abstract, the more you extract yourself from reality, and you're creating your own sort of set of things. And then once you're hyper individuated, now you just want to win. And it's the difference between the argument for the sake of winning versus the sake of truth. Truth is in the service of the greater good, and winning is just for me, right? So this is the I versus the we. And essentially, it seems like this also was just to sneak in some other things I want to talk about later, but this is the idea of now we're stuck in an emotive society. This is Alistair McIntyre's major point. We're highly emotive. This is all us doing sophistry, hyper individuated. So I'm relating this to like the Greeks are actually giving us, which almost later on is very important, is the birth of an individual. But then the individuals just take over too much, and it's all individuated. And then medieval is trying to do the opposite of this, which is really interesting. That there is a level of abstraction going on in the Christian world, but it's like the individual doesn't have this sort of abstraction. They're just buying into the priests or whatever, some sort of things going on, the rituals and practices. They're not abstracting as individuals. They're like, this I love the Monty Python here. It's like we are all individuals, and then someone says, I'm not, right? So they're all saying, well, I'm individuals, but then they're not individuals because they're not actually abstracting. So it's interesting. This is where I'm really curious. And next time you talk about Sophrosyne, I'm going to raise my hand because I was waiting for that, but I haven't heard anything. But Alistair McIntyre has a bunch on Sophrosyne and phronesis, which is pronounced differently in the book, and also some other things. But essentially, he's kind of claiming like the Aristotelian point of view that these are a set package. Arete is like one set. And if you have missing one of these, you have that tragic inverted thing. If you don't have all the arete, there's no arete, right? It's like if the cheetah has the desire, but he doesn't have legs, none of this works, right? So it's like some sort of set package that I'm going with this too, that it seems like all of these dialectics and things, if you're missing a component, you essentially lose the whole thing. It's like an organism that doesn't have a heart, yeah, that's done. So I'll end with a funny joke about this. Like the organs are all arguing who's the most important part of the human, the brain, the heart, the lungs, and of course the anus gets involved and says, guys, I'm the most important one. I'll show you. And essentially he doesn't let him poop. It's 1 day, 2 day, 3 days, 4 days, and then everybody at day 5 says, okay, you're the king, you're the most important, let us poop. Right? So it's a package deal that you have to have it all if you want to have this vitality Sophrosyne thing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right on. I'll never forget. It was sometime around 1980 when New York City had a garbage workers strike, and New York had to discover why it is that you should never ever ever try to screw over your garbage workers. It's like it doesn't matter how lofty you think you are. In high summer, that city's gonna stink like a dump, and your air conditioner can't help you with that. It's pretty soon everybody will capitulate, which is what they should have done in the beginning, because the garbage worker puts up with a lot. If he gets to the point where he can't stand it anymore, it's far worse than any of the rest of us could have stood. I mean, he spends all his life around garbage, and he can handle it. That is not a conflict we're ever going to win. They can hold out more. But yeah, let me take a moment on what you were saying, because there's a thing that you were saying that lined up with what Stephen was saying earlier, which I almost said, and then I said, no, I'm just going to continue on. But now you brought it up again, so now that it's haunting the discussion, I gotta bring it up, and it goes like this. The problem, Kenneth, he talks about this in his essay about Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. He says that the problem with these two half-witted modes of life, the dualic life, which is a life of begriff, i.e. naive gnosis, or the banausic life, which is a life of Verstand, which is naive noesis. Each of these is a half-witted strategy for life, and each one thinks it represents the whole picture. Right? It thinks that the other alternative is just bad beyond all conceiving. And they demonize each other. The easiest to see is from the position of the Banausos, because what the Banausos has done is eliminate what he perceives as chaos and irrationality from his life. He has the emotions they interrupt you. You're trying to get your work done, and suddenly you're struck with rage or jealousy or grief, and it interferes with your ability to work. And you fantasize, if you're a hyper intellectual, if only I could just suppress all these emotions. If only the only time I had emotions was when they were convenient, and they reinforced what I already wanted to do. I literally wrote this in a diary entry in my 20s. I mean, I know this mindset backwards and forwards. You see the irrationality and the emotionalism and the experientialism as a force of chaos. I can't program if there's kids running around the living room screaming. And if I can't program, I can't save lives. So I need it to be quiet. I need to negate the richness of life and push it away from me and create a quiet space that I can order in order to maximize my productivity at the Banausic activity that I'm trying to do. This is what it is to be a programmer. Donald, you see him when he comes on these calls, he's got his own room he's in where he does his programming, and he can shut the door and he can close out the whole rest of the world, including the people he loves. But love is a kind of chaos. And to an orderly mind, you've got to be able to schedule, when is love going to occur? When will you be interacting with your loved ones? And when will you close the door and say, now is my programming time, leave daddy alone? I got to be by myself. And this is central to Verstand. It's central to noesis. It's central to the Banausic life. And it leads to a life of abstraction, where you have, among other things, abstracted yourself out of the community that you're a part of. Like in the way that Ari said, you've literally extracted yourself and separated yourself from the chaos of the larger group with its parties and arguments, and somebody got in a car accident, and dear God, who knows what it's going to be from one day to the next. Going to create some insulation, right, to allow yourself to be productive. And I'll call on Sharon in just a sec. So, take care, Geneva. It was great to see you. So, but the thing is, to abstract, Ari was sort of alluding to this. To abstract is two things. First, you extract apart from the whole, right? So if I treat Sharon not as a person, but as an anesthesiologist, then the whole Sharon is left behind, and all I have is the use value Sharon, yes. The Sharon who can do this role. And I will only interact, if I'm abstracting her in that way in a hospital, then I only want to interact with her in the basis of that role. And when the other parts of her start to intrude, I feel like she's interfering with my ability to control the hospital. So there is this kind of suppression that happens that's part of the extraction process. But the second part of abstraction is that not only do I extract a piece from the whole, I then do, and this is a term that Kenneth Smith likes, I then treat that part as a synecdoche. And I put a link to the term in Wikipedia so you can look it up. But synecdoche is where you pretend that the part is a replacement for the whole. Let us just pretend that Sharon is an anesthesiologist and only an anesthesiologist. And I might be smart enough to say, for purposes of this discussion, we'll make this pretense. But too often in life, we forget that part and we just pretend. And then each of us ceases to be a whole person and we just become a unit in the economy that's supposed to produce and consume and spend. And when we do that, we're engaging in a lossy operation because most of what's been left behind is the important stuff. As interesting as it is that Sharon can do anesthesiology, there's a lot more to Sharon than that. And the part that I've left out by abstracting her into that role is the human part, the part where values and love and worries and family relationships and friendships and philosophy classes, all that stuff has been left behind. The meaning of life has been left behind. And it's part of what makes the Banausic life an empty life. But here's the thing, and now we take it back to Kierkegaard. As he points out, even though the doulos, who's so emotive and experiential, and the Banausos, who's so abstracted and intellectual, even though they think they're opposites, and they think that they sum up all of the possibilities of human existence, they're both wrong. There are larger possibilities for human beings than either of those things. But from the perspective of the Banausos, it was everything they could do to push away the chaos of all those emotions and experiences. And so if you tell a Banausos that he's living a partial human life and that he needs to add back in things that are missing, what he hears you say is, you've worked this hard to make things good, I now need you to make them evil. Put the chaos back in. Lose your ability to be productive. Lose your ability to earn a living. Give all that up. That's what he thinks you're saying. He can't comprehend the idea that there is a synthesis of gnosis and noesis that is bigger than either the life of a doulos or the life of a Banausos. He can't conceive of the idea that every good thing he has as a Banausos, he could also have as an Aristos, but he would also get back the other half of his life that he's lost. Because he thinks those things, first because he thinks those things are opposites and that they're incompatible. He can't imagine that it's his own life strategy that has made them seem to be incompatible. And second of all, part of what's happening is, it's why I put the reference to Edwin Abbott's book, Flatland. His conception of the world has become a zero-sum game. The chaos and the order together account for everything. There's nothing missing. There's a lacunae the size of the cosmos in there, but he can't see it. He thinks these are the sum total of possibilities. And so he's not willing to believe that he himself could grow his spirit to encompass both things in a greater whole that's healthier, and that he wouldn't have so much depression and ennui in his life, and that he wouldn't always be, sacrificing other people's lives for his own profit and making him feel bad and unable to sleep at night. He can't imagine that there's a way out of this trap. He thinks he's got the best that there is because he's made a flatland of his life. So this is what Kierkegaard's talking about. And in the earlier quote that Stephen did at the beginning of class and that I repeated a little bit ago, this is that thing. It's when you are stuck in a finite mode of the mind, especially when you've defined yourself in negation against some other finite mode of the mind. Part of the trap of the mind is that you can't imagine there are any other choices now. Your journey was hard enough, you think you've covered all the ground. You can't conceive of a dilation of the mind that would be capable of encompassing more than one perspective. And part of the reason that that's true is that you've scapegoated every mistake you ever made. You're blaming it on the thing that you've negated. You say, if anything bad comes as a consequence of my actions, that's not caused by reason or logic, which is order and which is all good and only good. You say, it must have been caused by emotionalism, by irrationalism, which is the source of all chaos, which means all bad things. So they create this false consciousness in which they can't take responsibility for their own bad actions. Everything that they do wrong, they blame on the part of their life that they've negated. I was too emotional. That's why they say the Nazis were full of hate. They can't imagine that the Nazis felt almost nothing for their victims, that their victims were abstractions to them. They just executed them en masse like numbers on a spreadsheet. They can't imagine that because they themselves are living orderly lives and they have decided that order and intellectualism is the source of all virtues. So therefore, if the Nazis did something wrong, it can't have come from order because order is the good thing. It must have come from the other thing. They think it's a zero sum. There's one good thing and one bad thing. So emotions must be the source. It must just be the case that when people do bad things, they're filled with rage and hate and anger. And in this way, they utterly misunderstand what it is when an American bomber pilot, presses the button and drops napalm on a bunch of Vietnamese peasants. He doesn't feel disgust and rage and a desire to kill. He's just doing his job that he's been trained to do. He feels nothing at all. Calls back to base. Okay, load's dropped. I'm heading back to pick up another load. It's just a day in the life, right? The idea that we have canonized something that's imperfect and shouldn't be canonized, and that we've demonized something that has merit in it and shouldn't be demonized. The idea that each half of the mind is contributing half of what's good and half of what's bad. It's inconceivable to both the doulos and the banausos. And in this way, it's not just that it never occurred to them to try to go on to be an Aristos, but that they've made it inconceivable that there could be anything else. And if you tried to talk them into it and say, come on, if you let these juices of life back in, if you reconnect yourself to family and reality, you'll live a richer life. They push hard against you. Like a man who doesn't want to be pushed off a cliff. He thinks you're trying to kill him. He will react with existential panic to fight against the dilation of his spirit that would allow him to transcend the aesthetic personality and become the ethical personality. This is core to Kierkegaard's argument. I haven't read him, but I've read a lot about it. So, I know this is one of the things I didn't say earlier, but that Stephen brought up, and it's highly relevant, and it comes up with what Ari's talking about too. This act of abstraction, it not only extracts, but by making a synecdoche of the part that it's extracted, it then suppresses the value of everything it's left behind. And therefore creates a false picture of the world in terms of where does good come from and where does bad come from. Sharon, you had your hand up first and you were first in line. You want to come off mute and tell us what you were going to say?
Well, I was just trying to get a better definition of abstraction, but you just explained it. I thought it was going to be like lack of discipline and self-control, which would make it simpler. But I guess it's more complex than that.
Yes.
So your explanation just amplified it.
Thank you, Sharon.
Yeah.
And Hegel is crystal clear that abstraction is the stupid pet trick. It's the core excellence of their Verstand. That's what noesis is great at. It can push behind the concrete details and pull out the abstract pattern and go, wow, I have this problem every Monday. Maybe I should anticipate next Monday and see if I can intercept the problem and keep it from happening. That ability to plan, to notice the past and learn from it and plan for the future, that's an incredibly valuable skill set. When we say that Banauseia is a problem, that Verstand is a problem, that noesis is a problem, we're not saying it would be good for the world to get rid of those things. Then we'd be halfwits again. We'd just be living an experiential, immersive life. We need both of these faculties, but we need them to work together. And that's the thing that naively they absolutely don't want to do. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was just bringing up the thing about the centrifugal and centripetal. Gunther Vaxsmith, there was a friend of Rudolf Steiner, was the one that brought up the issue quite a lot. Now, he's saying the centrifugal, you see the qualities in the centrifugalism are qualities like fanaticism and the fanciful. Now, this is where I'd take issue with the idea that the Nazis were dry reason, The Germans might have been dry reason. What the Nazis were a pack of maniacs that took over Germany. And they acquired the skills of people who could run things. Like Eichmann he sold vacuum cleaners at one stage. And he could run a business. He could run mass murder as a business. The actual core of the Nazi party were dreamers and fanatics. They succeeded because they employed people that could actually do stuff. Mussolini must have been envious. If only I had the Germans rather than the Italians. And you see this, of course, in the Marxists when they take over Russia. They're fanciful fanatics. We're going to build the paradise upon earth. And they will get there with the force of fanaticism. Adolf Hitler, in his vain attempt to conquer the world, will get there with the force of fanaticism. I have this fanciful dream, and we'll use fanaticism to get there. The term Philistine began to be used in a German university town when the normal populace, who were sensible people who went around their daily business, were confronted by a university who they decided was full of idiots. And the students and the townspeople would conflict. And of course, the students would come with all these crazy ideas and walk around town and try to tell these narrow-minded, sensible people stuff that they didn't want to hear. And the students termed the townspeople Philistines because, like in the Bible, the Philistines came out to laugh at the Hebrews when they were rebuilding the temple. So the Hebrews are building this, grand thing. And what are these Philistines doing? You're just mocking us because we're building something beautiful. Don't you appreciate the beautiful? You're just Philistines. And it's interesting. Of course, we would look down upon Philistinism, but, Verksmith would have said, well, it's actually a counterbalance to fanaticism. The fanatics will try to fight it out and they've only got one resolution. Let's kill each other. And the Philistine would say, maybe there's a different way, something more settled. And of course, you've got the fanciful versus the pendant. So, the pendant's about, doing the necessary things. And the fanciful's just a bit of a dreamer. But Verksmith talked about a balance between these two extremes. The Greeks that destroyed Troy were fanatics. You've taken one of our great queens. We're not going to stand for that. We're going to burn down half the world. Whereas a Philistine would have said, yeah, I know you're aggrieved, but oh well, you've got to blame Helen as well, and blah blah. But maybe you can work a deal to settle your differences rather than go to such an extreme. Now, looking at old Donald Trump, and you see this again and again, he comes out on the side of centripetal. He's typically Philistine, he's typically pedantic. And he's hanging around with all these dudes who are fanatics and who are fanciful. I don't know, does Donald Trump ever demonstrate any imagination? No, he's about just going by the numbers. Anyway, that's my little bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, the abstraction in the case of the Nazis, among other things, comes into play not just in the way they treat the Jews, as numbers, but in the way Hitler looks at Eastern Europe, which is full of Slavic people, and says to himself, God, I love those Karl May Western novels about the United States westward expansion and how great it was that they could slaughter all the Indians and just take over all this land. It allowed them to become a great nation by expanding. And he looks at the map of Europe and says, well, I'm never going to succeed expanding westward like that. And I don't even know that I want to. But these Slavs, they don't really matter. And I can imagine what it would be like if Eastern Europe were as empty as Karl May's American West was, and how Germany could just expand into that vacuum and it could become 10 times the size it is now, just like the 13 colonies expanded to vastly times their size. And that picture, that abstract picture of the map and what it could be like, ends up persuading him that it would be better to be that way than the way things concretely actually are. And this all really gets into Cornford's stuff about Aeschylus's model of the human mind and the way that we're seduced by desire and by persuasion and by not just by the things we want, but we can persuade ourselves that it's within reach. Because he's like, we're the greatest military in the world, and what the hell do these guys know about fighting? It maybe I could actually do it. And the whole thing could be written as a Greek tragedy easily. The seduction of the possibility, the falling in love with the abstract picture and caring nothing for the concrete reality. All of this, falls into this idea of abstraction versus. And then part of it too is he's failing to understand that Germany is part of a larger whole. Speaking of centripetal and centrifugal, he's imposing massive centrifugal force upon Europe as a whole in order to try to create a centripetal force for Germany itself. Germany, he wants to unite by making them be at odds with the whole rest of the world. And as we see, that's usually a terrible strategy. It doesn't work for cancer cells, and it didn't work for Nazi Germany. But I think everything you said is right. And I think you're especially insightful about the inversion. One of the big differences between Nazi Germany and the United States right now is that Nazi Germany was fanatics who had a bunch of kind of sober-minded people working for them to actually execute their plans. And weirdly, Donald Trump is not any kind of fanatic, however he may be painted. He's mostly looking for how to get rich quick all the time. He's got his eye on what's the next big thing that'll make me a bunch of money. But he's surrounded by fanatics who are the people working for him. And that's a weird inversion. And until you mentioned this, I never thought about what the significance could be. So I'm going to spend some time absorbing that, Stephen. Thank you for suggesting that antithesis. I just never noticed before. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I think part of the problem of the Western dialectic is a triangle relationship between the left and the right, the douloids and the banausoids, and create a synthesis. But Hegel hated the idea of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, right? So therefore, in a sense, that triangular relationship to him is false, because the whole thing is about a process situation. And I think part of me, even though I don't understand Chinese philosophy well enough, I do think that the Tao has influenced me a great deal. Because the Tao, we don't know what the Tao is. But the important thing is we know the way to the Tao, the path, the process of getting to the Tao. It's what the whole thing is about, because we are limited beings and we have to bump into things, and it's the path that leads to the thing. So in some sense, I'm always trying to find it within the Tao itself, the path itself is not a dialectic. It's something that, in a sense, the path is in some ways in the middle, because the relationship between the positive and negative, I think there's something in between. And I'm trying to find the middle way that in some sense expresses the cosmos better than the concept of the dialectic, the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, because I think that's a process philosophy. And one of the things I want to give you is like, when somebody asks me, what happened if you were driving, let's say at 2 a.m. in the morning, and you're way out in the country, and you come across a red light? You know damn well there's nobody around. You look both ways. Absolutely, you know. Would you run the red light? Or would you just wait until the red light turns green? And I say, well, those are kind of funny choices. But I would make a choice in a sense that I both obey the law and transgress the law. I would come to the light and I make a right turn because it's perfectly legal to make a right turn. I drive down a little way and make a U-turn, perfectly legal, unless there's a sign that says no U-turn. I come to the stoplight and I make another right turn. I am finding a middle way that's both obeying the social structure and, in some sense, the cosmic structure, in some sense. And I think the dialectic of one choice versus another is too limiting, because I think the cosmos is much more complex, and your choice is much more complex in terms of finding a middle way. This is what's guided me in terms of my producing of art, because I'm trying to find some middle way in which the art could happen. My creativity of prospects, in some sense, is important. And now I would switch to a situation which it actually happened to me. This is sort of half a year out of graduate school. So 1 year or half a year past that. And I was a very, very good friends with my neighbor who's still in graduate school, but he's his last year. And we were intimate friends. And not only that, he was my landlord. I had a lot of fun with him. He respected my art, I respected his art, and we both share a lot of things, a lot of good times. He was my best friend. And one day the seminar was held in his place because it's a nice place. It's comfortable, he built it. And I was teaching color theory at that time at Sacramento State. So I knew a lot about color. I've been teaching color for quite a while. And this guy came up with what's called a color card, in that color card to help people, look at the colors and so forth, make choices. And he starts shuffling it. He said, look at this. I discovered something. When I do it this way, it comes out this way. And look at it this way, this way and that way. And there was a lot of us looking at him and knowing that he's making a mistake. But as time went by, as he went further and further, the other people disappeared. I was the only one left that was still arguing with him. And I finally said, yeah, you discovered something, okay. You discovered somebody else's system. You didn't discuss the cosmos. At that point, he got so angry, even though we were intimate friends, the best of friends, he threw me out of the house. I was really offended, okay? And I wouldn't speak to him. I guess he could have thrown me out of my studio because he was my landlord. He didn't do that. The seminar leader, who's a teacher, pulled me aside and one day said, Phil, of course you're right. You're a liberal thinker. You're right. But you forgot that Gale operates in the idea that a man's home is his castle. And when you push him to the link, and we all left because we knew that was coming, he's going to do something drastic. He threw me out. Because I was offended because I was his best friend and he was my best friend. Well, how dare he throw me out? So I wouldn't speak to him for a while, even though the teacher sort of said I was kind of wrong, you know. I didn't agree with him totally, but I sort of understood what he was saying. And so one day I was outside, and his name is Gail. He said, "Phil, are we still good buddies?" And I came to him and I said, "Yes, we're still good buddies. It's just that we're not as good a good buddy as we used to be." He accepted that apology of mine and accepted his apology. And he also accepted that in some sense, maybe I was right, that our friendship was deeper than his castle. Okay. So in some sense, that was a middle path. We were able to negotiate with each other. And I think he accepted the fact that we're still good buddies, but not as good a good buddy as we were before. And we could go on from there. And so I think that is the middle way you have to find, you know, because there's not one way or the other way. We have to come up with some process that in a sense mediates and allow us to coexist and still be good friends, very good friends, you know. So I thought, once again, that's a process-oriented philosophy because you have to come through, and that is a road to where your destiny is. And I think that's an important thing, is to find some creative way to explore the possibilities without necessarily restricted to the dialectic of one and the synthesis and the triangular relationship. We should all keep that in mind, that the process is much more complicated than a triangle. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. That's absolutely an important warning. You know, it's the reason that Hegel focuses on the dialectic is because it's so hard to get people to understand even two things and how they can not just be enemies, but have to reconcile into some new third state. You start talking the way Heraclitus does, in which your character is full of different, you know, energies, and they all are going their own direction, but they collide with each other. And so you're getting reconciliation after reconciliation and building this complex web of fountains of order, and people's minds just blow. You know, it's like, what, you need to drop some acid to visualize it? It's a whole world of streams flowing in and transforming each other, and that's the web of existence. It's hard for people to grasp, but in attempting to simplify it down to its basic pieces, the bud, the blossom, and the fruit, I think you're right that it does lead to a temptation to see things as simpler than they are. So thank you for that. So how about chapter 8? Let's move into our next chapter of this, if people are game. This is Medieval Civilization 4, section D, Divine Teleology, Heaven and Hell. So we're going to be talking theology and comparative theology.
Well, you only got 10 minutes. Of course,
20.
we could go overtime. All right.
20 minutes. We're gonna dive in, see how far we can get. And he starts out with a reasonable introduction. At this point, the notes that I wrote for the first sentence are irrelevant because we've already talked about them. He says the Greeks believed their gods were intimately entangled with every individual life. Indeed, every single person's life and desires were in the care of a daimonic guardian. And of course, I paused there because daimon, this is of course a Heraclitus reference, ethos anthropoi daimon. And this is one of those places where it's really useful to pick up a copy for free, which you can do online from the Internet Archive, of F.M. Cornford's book, From Religion to Philosophy, which is about how Greek philosophy arose from Greek religion. It's also a good time to think about Gilbert Murray's book, 5 Stages of Greek Religion. Between them, they really give you a immersion in the structure of Greek religion, which is nothing like what we learn by reading mythology. Right? Mythology is modern translations arranged for modern sensibilities to fit a modern worldview. We think that their relations to their deities were pretty much the same as ours, were the medieval ones, or something we know. And that's couldn't be further from the truth. And so as Cornford argues pretty well, I think, in From Religion to Philosophy, and he brings it up again in Thucydides' Myth Historicus, the Olympian religion we're familiar with is erected atop an older religion. The Olympian religion is in some ways a construct in which the Olympian project to get the Greeks out of the Dark Ages has tried to weld together a bunch of tribal divinities into a single coherent pantheon. And it's why after that welding together process, it seems like Zeus was, constantly having affairs relentlessly one after another, and Hera's always following him around trying to catch him at it. But that's not how any of this originally went. Zeus, that we identify from our myths, was originally a whole bunch of different deities. And in order to get all the tribes on board, they had to merge the histories and characteristics of all those divinities into a single super deity, Zeus, who stands in for the hundreds of tribal deities. And so, of course, if you put all the stories together, he's sleeping with all these different women. But, in the original stories, each of these source gods might have only slept with one woman. They might have all been faithful. But by the time you merge them into super deity here, he's slept with 100 women. And so how could he be faithful? So that's the kind of artifactual things that happen as a result of this process, which is called syncretism, of pulling together a bunch of different traditions and creating a sort of, like in the same way you might make an artificial language by pulling vocabulary out of different languages. That's what Esperanto does. And this is what the Greeks were doing in their Olympian project. And the argument that that Cornford makes is that this Olympian religion was created partially as a justification for the Olympic Games and the new tradition of tragedy that we're all going to be watching plays together that are going to teach us about the inner life of human beings, and we're going to try to make people wiser. And that we're going to be reciting the Iliad over and over and over and over. Every Olympic Games we're going to recite it again. And part of that requires that we have these characters that we all know and appreciate, like Zeus and Athena and Hera and Ares and so on. And so that's why they made this as one of the cornerstones of the new pan-Hellenic culture that they tried to artificially create, is that you have to agree on this core pantheon. And you can have as many other deities as you want. That's why their polytheism is not at all like monotheism. Is they're like, we're not trying to tell you who you're not allowed to worship. We're just trying to say in the mix you have to include these 12, because this is our lingua franca. This is our Chinook trade language. This is our how we can understand each other. We need this common ground. And Cornford says that because it was an artificial thing cobbled together, it never really had all of the loyalty, the religious fide or piety or faith that the Greek possessed. It was a construct and an artificial one. Cornford says you can see that, for example, in how many references there are in Plato and elsewhere to people whose the way that they interacted with the Olympian deities is not what anybody today would call pious. They sort of could take it or leave it. Some of them would brag about their atheism, but generally they just sort of like, yeah, whatever. And he says it's especially clear with Thucydides. He says he's writing the history of the Peloponnesian War, and nowhere does he attribute any single event that happens to the will of the gods. And Cornford says that is a deeply irreligious attitude. I mean, for a people who supposedly worship these deities, and you read Homer and Hesiod and any number of other places, you can see they're constantly saying this happened because of so and so, the deity. And yet Thucydides doesn't once say, well, Ares was what caused the battle of such and such. And so he says what he sees here is an evidence for something like what Kierkegaard is complaining about in Denmark so much later, which is effectively you have a state religion that people can, take it or leave it. Some people are more faithful towards it. Others are sort of like, yeah, that's that thing we do, whatever. But he says what he detects in Cornford, what Cornford detects in Thucydides is that even though he has seemingly stripped away all the supernaturalism from his worldview, and now he wants to account for the entire war and all of its events in terms of what naturally actually happened. Nevertheless, the way he explains human behavior shows that Thucydides still believes in the older, deeper stratum of religion that existed before the Olympian. pantheon was cobbled together and put on top of it. And he says that's the daimon religion. Very much like Shintoism in Japan, the Greeks believed that everything is full of spirits, and these spirits are little gods. And they thought everything is full of gods. That's Thales' third proposition. Everyone talks about Thales thinks everything's made of water. He also says everything has got intelligence or psyche in it. And furthermore, it's all full of gods. Everything is full of gods. Everywhere you look, there's a god of that rock, there's a god of that tree, there's a god of that waterfall. There's gods galore. And it's why one of the Heraclitus fragments that's been preserved seems to echo Thales. He says, here too there are gods, as he's warming his hands by a fire. He's like, there's the, and that this concept of a daimon is that a daimon corresponds to a character. That there is, that a rock has a daimon is a way of saying there is a certain geological, chemical rockiness that we would attribute to laws of nature, that the Greeks attribute to the rock itself. And they say this rock has a tendency to hold itself together and resist impacts, and it does certain things with temperature, and if you drop it in the water it doesn't float, and there's a whole bunch of things about the rock, and the sum total of all that stuff together is the ethos of the rock, and that the rock will tend to behave or not behave. It will tend to exist in a way that reinforces and carries out and fulfills that ethos. Every bit as much as an acorn tries to grow into an oak, the rock tries not to grow into an oak. It tries not to sprout legs and walk places. It has its own behavior and lack of behavior, and is going to try to enforce that. And so they anthropomorphize this. So it's easier for a person to understand character the way that we understand people, because we get that other people have their own character. Phil has the ways that he's going to talk and the subjects that he wants to discuss. And Ari and Sharon and Steve, everybody's got their own approach to things because they each have their own character. We grow up knowing that long before we engage in science, and the Greeks say, so it's easiest to look at an oak tree and say, yeah, the oak is like a person. It's got its own character. It's got its own mind, if you will. It's got its own soul, and that thing functions like a tiny god. It may not be the god of much, but it's the god of that tree, by God. it's going to try to do tree-like things. And that as you interact with nature, you can't just do like Hitler and pretend that the Slavs aren't there and we'll just take Eastern Europe, because that ends with you being defeated in Russia. It's like when you walk out into the world, you have to acknowledge that each of these things has its willfulness and its intelligence, and it's that it is not just what it is, but is also the fruit of its past self and the seeds of its future self. It is in a process of transformation, and we're just capturing a flicker in a film that we're mistaking for a fixed state. All of this is part of what they mean by phusis, the world as flow and change. So this daimon level of religion is what he's alluding to here when he says, every single person's life and desires were in the care of a daimonic guardian. What Heraclitus actually means by ethos anthropoi daimon is, just like that rock has a daimon, just like that waterfall has a daimon, just like that acorn has a daimon, each of us has a daimon. And rather than being our guardian angel, it's our rider. It's what's bringing things to our conscious attention, or, God help us, not bringing things to our conscious attention, causing us to habitually overlook the kinds of things that each of us would habitually overlook. That's our daimon. This is the full import of what Kenneth means here. It's a complex religion. It has complex things to say about free will and determinism. It has complex things to say about agency and contingency, but it models these things pretty well. It doesn't have to be literally true in order to be a whole lot more effective than a lot of the ways that we try to talk about human beings. A human is transparently, obviously not a computer, right? The brain is not a computer. It's just patently obvious that it's not a computer. Our models suck by comparison. I like that Ari brings in the stuff about neuroanatomy and neurophysiology, because that's where we start to see science trying to grapple with, how does this thing actually work? And the conclusion that they reach is similar to the conclusions the Greeks reach. It's complicated. There are a lot of forces at work in the human mind, pushing and pulling in different directions, and it's through the reconciliation of those energies that we end up doing the specific thing that we did, making the specific choice that we made. So then he can, so that's what he's setting as the baseline to get started with. When he says the gods were intimately entangled, it's part of what he means. And it's part of why he brings it down from the theoi Olympian scale all the way down to the daimon, your individual ethos scale. He continues, and they believe that each divinity wove a pattern of justice, which for the severely imbalanced mind or life meant retribution for moral or religious negligence. And this is a takeoff on something the Greeks talk about a lot. They're always just as interested in the negative as they are in the positive. There are not just a set of things you should or must do. There are also a set of things you should or must not do. The forbidden things, the taboo things. You know, I must not break into Phil's house and live there as though it's mine. It's his. I must not shove Sharon aside and pretend that I'm the anesthesiologist in the group, because it's just not true. I have to know my limits. And if I don't know my limits, I'm a kind of crazy. There's something wrong with me. This is how the Greeks envisioned the world. So every character isn't just full of what are the things you can do, but implicitly it's full of what are the things that at least right now you can't do and should not do. If you want to dabble along the edges and learn and make mistakes and get better, that's all well and good. But I have no business putting on the coat and the mask and sitting down in the operating room and putting my hand on the knob. I should stay away from that. That should be forbidden. That's absolutely not okay. And this term retribution is a very Greek term. Nemesis. The word you want is nemesis. That they conceived Nemesis as a winged goddess who would fly to avenge wrongs, like the Furies do in the Oresteia after Agamemnon. They chase Orestes around. This is what happens when you violate the lines of the things you're not supposed to do. Nature stings you. It pursues you. Heraclitus says, even the sun, as powerful as the sun has these same kinds of limits on him that we have on us. And if he strays from his limits, then vengeance shall surely pursue him. This is one of the ways that the Greeks don't have a supernaturalist religion. They have a naturalist religion. The gods are not exempt from these laws of nature. Yeah, and lying, it might be okay in some cases, and in other cases, it's going to screw you over. You need to know where that's the case. You need to know where the lines are. You need to understand the consequences. Because when you violate natural law violates you. This was a Greek concept. Retribution is a major part. And so this is what happens in Aeschylus's Agamemnon. Agamemnon violates the laws of nature and family and humanity when he sacrifices his daughter to change the winds so that the Greeks can sail to Troy to go kick their ass. And when Artemis had her oracle tell him that the only way he was going to get the winds to go his direction was to sacrifice his daughter, what she meant was, so give up and go home, because you don't want to be an inhuman thing that would sacrifice his own daughter. But Agamemnon said, I am the king of kings. If that's what's required, then I will sacrifice my daughter. At which point, his fate was sealed and retribution came to him when he came home. Right? And Andromache does him in. He gets home and he gets murdered. And that's what should happen to him. That's the retribution for his moral and religious negligence. This is very core to the Greek concept. And it's even implicit in the modern scientific concept, even though the modern marketplace doesn't like this part of science. Science warns us, do not stick your fingers in the socket. Do not step off the cliff and expect that you're going to float. You have to respect that nature is a realm of forces and energies, and it will trample you if you try to violate it. But, our modernist concepts of license suggest that that's not the case. We should be allowed to do anything we want to, and that nobody should stop us, because nothing's more sacred than the human will. He continues, respecting the right values meant cultivating a sense of balance or measure, an intelligent sense of proportion, to adjudicate how much of one's life or energies or concern should be apportioned to each principle that had a claim on one's soul. He's talking about polytheism, right? Polytheism doesn't mean I'm a blacksmith, so I'm just going to worship Hephaestus and ignore the rest of them. In role-playing games, when people are imagining what it would be like to be Greek, we're constantly doing that. What's my one god out of the pantheon? But the Greeks went, no, these are all reflecting parts of nature that have authority over you. And the one that you don't pay attention to is the one that's going to screw you over. You need to live a life in balance. You need to live a life heeding all of the things that matter around you. And that's why polytheism. Each of these things is something you should heed. And that's what he's saying here. And that's what people were saying earlier about the virtues. The one that you're missing becomes the defining thing in your life. You need to get a complete harmony going in order to not have blind spots that you're going to step into. He continues, justice is not an empty abstraction, but an artful judgment, gnosis, diagnosis, right? Diagnosis contains gnosis in it. Ever noticed that before? Diagnosis of how much is due, what is not giving too little, and what is not giving too much. And if you're not hearing Aristotle's golden mean here, you got more reading ahead of you, right? He's definitely, there's no question Kenneth is alluding to Aristotle here with this concept that for everything there is a just amount. And the just amount is not like a centrist or moderate believes, it's not in the middle. The just amount is wherever the just amount is. It's somewhere between the extremes, but you have to be intelligent and alive to your life and paying attention to what works and what doesn't work and learning from the mistakes of others to figure out when should something be in the middle? When should it be off to one side? When should it be off to the other? You got to find the healthy spot, not the arithmetic middle spot. His golden mean is not the arithmetic mean. It's the mean of Sophrosune. Aha, I said Sophrosune. You were waiting and I finally said it. The values that constitute the psychological metabolism or fuel of our higher life also help us describe our moral and political sense of form. So he's describing a cosmos in which the value system matters, a worldview in which the value system matters, a worldview in which you can't just have an AI give you the answer. You can't just have a calculator or spreadsheet give you the answer. You can't do things by formula. You have to mentally be alive to the world and be paying attention to how it shifts and changes around you so that your response can shift and change with it. The right thing to do is not the same thing in every situation. Abstract notions of justice are useless here. I mean, it's okay to study abstract notions of justice and carry them around with you, but only the way that you might carry around your phone in your pocket. It doesn't mean you try to solve every problem by hammering on it with your phone. You know, the thing you have to pay the most attention to is what concretely is happening right now, right here, and what would be the healthiest, rightest thing to do in response to that. And, you know, when he's talking about harmonies and balancing and adjudication, you should also be getting a little bit of Hegel's concept of Vernunft, which is the reconciliation of the half-witted strategies of Begriff and the half-witted strategies of Verstand, reconciled with each other into a harmony, a shifting harmony. Sometimes you have to pay more attention to the experience. Sometimes you have to pay more attention to your training. But almost always it's going to be some blend of them both. I mean, I'm sure Sharon could fill 3 hours with stories of comparing and contrasting. What did she learn in med school? What did she experience on the job? And how did she have to navigate between these tensions? The one tension to be all in the moment, the other tension to always fall back on the recipes of what you learn in school. And what anybody in Sharon's position who's as good as she is learns is you need that Vernunft. You need that dialectic, that shifting sense of balance between them in order to work out what the right thing is to do. And then, even though we're at the top of the hour, I'm going to just do one more sentence because that gets us to the end of paragraph 1. And that's this. The Greeks also regarded the ultimate order of life and of the cosmos to be bound by the self-fatedness of character, ethos. That is, the resolution and irony of the kind of story or mythos in which the 3 sisters, fates, 3 sister fates, implicated every person and every people. That is to say, just like each of us has an ethos or a psyche or a daimon, just like every waterfall and every tree, the cosmos as a whole, the sum total of the laws of nature, and all the energies and forces within it makes up the soul of the cosmos that explains why it behaves the way that it behaves. And this is, I put together a little thing here. I think it's Thales, I can't remember, who said, Phusis is to cosmos as psyche is to somos. That is, the soul in our body has the same relationship as Phusis, what Heraclitus calls nature, has to the whole cosmos. It's the soul of the cosmos, just like the soul is the soul of the body. It is our character at work, right? Why do we behave the way we do? Why do we notice or not notice the things we do or don't? Why do we act or don't act the way that we do? The answer is the same for the cosmos as a whole as it is for us as an individual. It has its ethos, which is much bigger because it's much bigger. It's much more complex because it's more complex, but it's still an ethos. The phusis that Heraclitus talks about is an ethos. It is the character of the whole. And so it too has its unfolding over time and its transformations. Sharon, come off mute. I can see you want to add something before we wrap up.
So next time when you come back, can we talk about the three sister fates? Because I think that this is the final sentence in the paragraph, but it says a lot.
Yes.
About that which preceded it.
Yes. Yes,
okay.
It pulls it all together. We'll start right there.
All right. Thank
could
you.
I ask you, there seems to be a lot of relationship between what you just stated and romanticism. Are you going to either through the Middle Ages explain that relationship or contrast, or you're going to wait till the modern period to explain that? Because that relationship seems very, very important to me.
Yeah, for sure. We'll talk about that in the modern epoch. Because the modern epoch is the tug of war between going along with the abstractedness of modern life and then resisting it on the other hand. Because it doesn't feel good. So
yeah,
I hope you had a good time.
I want to say something also, Rick, similarly. I don't know if you remember this, but I'm sure you will do it anyways, which is essentially what you were saying. I wasn't able to grasp. I kind of spaced out, or it just was just completely like missing. So I hope you could start next week with more of this, because it was very confusing to me.
We'll start right there. All
right, thanks.
Thanks, Ari.
All right, goodbye, guys.
The three sisters are ethical. Three sister fates.
Yes. We will start right there.
Okay. Have a good week, guys.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
It's been a pleasure. And for those of you who are new, thanks for joining this week.